Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video I'm back with another review of another BB Can season, the latest season of the show, BB Can 11. Which is a strange season in the sense that this is obviously the first season of BB Can to not have live feeds, and through that severely limited our information on what was actually going on in the game, while also obviously lowering the amount of online presence that the show had, and through that there just was less enthusiasm for the season as a whole. Though despite that, I do feel like this ended up being a pretty solid season, a season that kind of worked despite of itself, where it felt like production was making a lot of questionable decisions, which just ended up working out. And I will say there were frustrations during the first week and also towards the end of the season, but that doesn't really take away from the entire product as a whole, which might not be up to par with the last few BB Can seasons, but I think it's still a very solid season in its own right. Though obviously the exclusion of live feeds does take a lot away from the experience, where instead we got these digital dailies that were simply just not that great. I mean, while we did get some good content here and there, it was also filled with a lot of boring conversations or just straight up product placements like Vanessa vacuuming. But either way, I'll still be running through the season from beginning to end like I normally do. So with that, let's start off with week 1, which ends up being a different week 1 here in the fact that BB Can, for the first time ever, decided to do a proper week 1, not just 2 episodes where they try to cram an entire week's worth of gameplay into one episode, but instead have a full week and a half for the first round of gameplay, similar to how BBUS does it. And I think as a whole that is a step in the right direction, though the problem is that they didn't really utilize that time that well, which we'll talk about. But we start the season with the introduction of the BB Can Manor, obviously introducing us to the theme of the season, of this whodunit, which again, I typically don't really care about the themes that much, but again, cool to see the show still go all in on these. Also here we get talk about how you don't want to come in last, which made it feel like it was going to be this prevalent theme throughout the entire season when the twist associated with it literally lasts only a week. By the way, we obviously get introduced to the players, which something that's annoying about BB Can is that the intros to the players are literally just recycled material from what we got in the preseason, which made a lot of this feel extremely repetitive at the time that it was airing for people that actually checked out stuff on the preseason. But we do obviously get some great intros here from the likes of who calls herself Big Daddy K, and she ends up being a great character across this season, instantly showing it in her intro package with her being upset at being called a regular person. We get Zach, who is a douche, and initially there was this like thought in my mind of like, okay, he's friends with Emmett from BB Can 1, maybe he's just playing this up, maybe this isn't who he actually is, maybe this is him trying to get cast through acting this way. But no, this is actually who he is. We're literally just in the segment, he already calls himself the Kim Kardashian of Ottawa, and it's like Zach ends up being like such an unlikable presence across this season, though he did have moments of being a fun villain along the way. We also get the intro to Amal, who has blessed our TV screens and has the occupation of super fan, which was funny, but this is literally all of Amal's content on the season, which is obviously a shame. And then get Daniel, who I had known from watching him play Sequester, and I was happy to see him get a chance. He's been playing since the very beginning of the show and kind of details his strategy right from the very beginning of him talking about playing with the girls and the guys and playing the middle. We do also get an intro to Anika, who said coming in that she's just gonna wing it, not knowing anything about the show, which, I mean, to be fair to her, I do feel like she actually had some decent game sense at points, though obviously it kind of works out like you would expect it to. But anyway, here we also get introduced to the dead last twist, a twist that if you come in last in the HOH comp, you will automatically be nominated, meaning there'll be 3 nominees for the week, and this is terrible. Like, this is a terrible twist, a twist that once again puts more emphasis on comp wins, and through that very much benefits these bro-y guys that we will talk about later, but also beyond that also gives more power to the majority alliance, where this just makes it more likely that someone in the minority will end up on the block. In a situation where if a person in the minority wins HOH, instead of being able to flip the entire power structure because they now hold all the power, if one of their allies ends up being on the block due to this twist, the majority can still hold the numbers anyway. And again, it is just a terrible twist through and through, and thank God they got rid of it really soon. But we do learn that the HOH comp will be played in pairs, where they get to pick their own pairs, and through that we do learn about certain relationships in the game. Right away, we do see Ty and Zach make a final 2 deal right as they enter, which ends up being a very important relationship in this season, though also an extremely unlikable one. We do also see Rob and Hope bond right away, with Rob showing some game acumen, with him telling Hope to throw the HOH comp as they don't want to put targets on themselves. The problem is that that's the incorrect strategy, in the fact that you should be wanting to win HOH to create the overall power structure, but really ends up working kind of in his favor for this first week at least. But eventually we get to HOH comp, where we strangely have one of the players having to untangle themselves through a net, which is kind of awkward looking, but after that they do a puzzle, and we do see JM and Santina win the comp, which they obviously make a deal saying that they're not going to put each other up, which won't last, as they will later do another comp to determine who is the actual HOH between the two, though strangely their win of this comp is the ending of episode 1, despite the fact that we still need to see the rest of the comp for who comes in last place, and we start episode 2 with more of this comp, which was just a weird way to break up these episodes. Anyway, Renee and Shania come in last, with Renee being upset that her bootay could hit the block, which her constantly saying the word bootay ends up being super humorous to me across this season. But anyway, episode 2 ends with the HOH and dead last comp being played at the same time, where obviously the winner of the HOH side of things will be HOH, while the loser on the dead last side of things will go on the block. And strangely, this comp has a puzzle section that involves creating a statue of Kevin Jacobs, which was weird, but Santina ends up winning the HOH after talking about how she doesn't think she can trust JM, which is not a great sign. Well, really, both Shania and Renee were not that good at this comp, though Shania beats Renee. And really, this entire comp structure here of having 2 comps to determine the HOH and dead last really just felt like it was there because they felt like they needed a comp for episode 2, in a position where I personally feel like they could have used the time to detail a lot more of the game relationships, as they really don't do a lot of that in week 1. But also, I should mention episode 2 is also where we do learn that Amal had to leave the game, which really gets glossed over in the edit. But again, it sucks to see Amal, someone that is a massive fan of the show and has demonstrated that through her online activity after the show, and having her leave the game here just felt extremely underwhelming. I feel like she's someone that it seems like she was decently poised to do well. I mean, she was supposedly close to Kuzi, and considering Kuzi's later positioning with Daniel and Anika, I feel like that could have been this very solid alliance, though obviously never truly know how it would have played out. But with that, we get to the rest of week 1, which had a really bad start. I mean, considering the fluidness of the season beyond this, week 1 was a week where I was extremely worried we're going to get a redo of BB Can 7, of just the bros coming together running the game. But at least with BB Can 7, it was like some pretty good players doing that. Well, here it was a group of pretty bad players. Right away, we see Zach talking about wanting to work with the bros, with Zach becoming a main narrator of this week, to where there ends up being this alliance of Zach, Ty, Rob, Jonathan, and Hope, an alliance that wasn't properly shown on the show, with Hope not being included in it for some reason. So obviously they have the standard brigade strategy here of pulling in a woman to get the majority, where they talk about having Claudia, Shania, Renee, and Kuzi alongside them, which really just kind of shows you how easy a strategy like this is to execute, as long as you're a somewhat competent player, which we later see that these guys are not. But anyway, we also get talk about how dangerous JM is, with Ty talking about how he's targeting the boys, and we later see Zach bonding with Dan, during which JM walks in and they supposedly form this trio, which felt kind of awkward. But JM talks about how he's not afraid of making big moves, and the show tries to portray this as this is the reason why JM gets targeted, with Zach taking this information to the boys, though again, we saw that previous scene where JM was already being targeted. And straight up, the entire targeting of JM did kind of feel a bit icky. Again, it very much felt in line with the likes of an Eddie or a Neil having been targeted by these bro alliances in the past, simply because he doesn't fit in with them and he comes off as a strategic player, and JM again 100% fits in that mold. We also have Zach talking about how he can influence Santina to backdoor JM, which ends up being the actual plan for the week, though is one that I don't get why Zach did. It's actually really stupid for Zach to be doing this, where that's the thing about Zach, is that Zach ends up running the early game of this season. The problem is that he runs it in the worst possible way. He's running in a way that he's getting rid of his own allies and keeping in these people that are more likely to come after him. I mean, JM is someone that never had the intention of coming for Zach. It's so stupid. I mean, Zach's entire strategy in this game is just ridiculously dumb. But I do think it very much shows you just how easy it is to gain control at the beginning of Big Brother, where, like, Zach, all he had to do is just be an active player. I mean, most players play Big Brother very scared, especially early on, and do that just want to know a name to go after, and Zach does this very effectively and just willing to put his neck out there, and through that gets his way, despite the fact that I don't get how people are trusting Zach. Like, to me, if I see someone like Zach in my real life, I instantly know you're a con man. I genuinely don't get how anyone trusts Zach in any facet, but I guess they did. And even beyond that, again, just the Bro Alliance as a whole is not playing well here, which is the frustrating thing of it all, is that they're not even hiding their alliance. Yeah, we get like Claudia talking about how the bros are working together. Also, like, strangely tells Zach this, to which Zach is upset. Like, how could they know that we're working together? It's like, what do you think? But anyway, Claudia does get a very good start to this season. Again, being portrayed in the DR as being the only one to pick up on the guys working together, which has her telling Santina this, only for Santina to say that, no, they're not aligned. They're just hanging out, which was extremely frustrating to see. But I think this played a factor into Claudia later winning the Bel Air Direct Eviction Protection Insurance, which is obviously this twist that we've seen last season of Canada getting to vote to save one person. Though also, to be fair to Claudia, she is from PEI, which I know has a very dedicated fan base to where she probably would have won the vote anyway. But she definitely did come off likable right away here. But beyond this, we also get Santina's HOH room, learning that they're going to get Wendy's breakfast from Wendy's every week, which thank God for that, along with the fact that they can also win Wendy's reward points, which, I mean, who cares? But they also get the typical outfit from Winners, which also later on in the week, we get this Winners fashion show segment because we needed product placement. But also we have Daniel finding the Circle K room, and we get the segment of the players being handcuffed for the night, which, like, all this was just such a waste of time. And again, like, it was disappointing that we focused on these things instead of actually setting up the actual game dynamics of the show. But thankfully, we do get to see some showmances, including Ty and Claudia, which was just such an unlikable showmance. I mean, Ty is just one of the most unlikable people I feel like that's been on Big Brother in a while, where he just really comes off as a massive dick throughout his entire run here, especially in the way that he treats Claudia. But even beyond that, just comes off super controlling and super cocky about his position in the game, thinking that he can control everybody, talking about how he's ruling this kingdom. And just by the way he walks around, you can tell that he thinks that he's running this game. But beyond that, we also get the setup of the showmance between Santina and Rob, which was just kind of boring, though they kind of had a love triangle to a degree with Shania, though, again, it didn't really matter that much. Though, to be honest, we do see Santina taking JM to Wendy's, where we do find out that her mom is there in person to give her Wendy's. Again, the return of former players being there in person, that was kind of cool. Also, obviously associating each week with the week that another player had won HOH. So again, that's a cool trend across this season. But it is during this conversation that Santina seems to still be wanting to work with JM, only for JM to mention that he would put up one of the boys. Which now is Santina talking about how he's put a target on himself, which is like, there was one already. But Santina does talk about how she really wants to work with the strong men and people who know the game, which is like, none of the strong men do. They're all recruits. Literally, the only super fans in this season were the people that were not the strong men. But obviously, this leads to Santina being completely manipulated by Zach, where we do have Zach giving her his typical spiel, which again, like me, if I was listening to this, I would just instantly know he's trying to manipulate me. Yeah, for some reason, Santina buys into this. But again, the way that Zach talks about John Michael here is kind of icky. One, not even remembering his name, keeps on saying John Martin, but then talks about how he's driven by ego and talks about how he's going to be a problem and you have to backdoor him. He's going to blow up if you don't. And it's like, why? None of this seems to be based around anything John Michael has actually done, but we do get Santina fighting back a bit on this and the fact that she wants to put John Michael up right away, to which Zach is incensed that she wouldn't go through with his plan and tells her that he's worried about mansplaining to her, only for him to then go and mansplain to her, saying that no one in the real world is as successful as he is. And Zach openly admits that getting rid of JM kind of hurts his game, which makes me question again, why are you doing it then? But anyway, Santina agrees to backdooring JM and nominating Anika and Dan instead, with her having literally just promised Anika that she won't go on the block, which was even more indicative of Santina's poor play here, where obviously this is terrible play from Santina. I mean, to get rid of JM, someone that she has this instant bond with. Now, it's not entirely bad in the sense that while, yes, she is doing the dirty work of the bros, at this point, the bros were actually loyal to her. So again, it's not entirely bad, as it does buy her inroads with the bros. At the same time, it does lose her respect from everyone else. So I do think all in all, yeah, it is bad, but it's not as bad as certain other HOHs we'll be later talking about, even though it is still bad. But this is also where Anika gets some pretty bad content in my eyes as well, where she talks about how JM, Dan, Claudia, and Renee are running this game, which don't know how she came to that conclusion, but she ends up being very anti-JM this week, which I do think it was just overall not the right mindset there, but eventually nominations go through. However, following that, we do start to see some of the target shift to Renee, where Renee tries to campaign for herself to Zach, seeming to recognize the fact that the bros are working together, so again, good for her. However, this campaign turns Zach against her, and now they talk about the possibility of taking her out, to which Rob, being close to Shania and Renee, wants to keep Renee, which leads to this tension between the two that obviously culminates in becoming a target by the end of the week. Though this is not the only reason for Rob being targeted, as there is this other situation that comes up, which is just really stupid, in that Ty has this conversation with Claudia, however recognizes that Claudia is wearing Rob's sweater, and he gets super insulted by this, and it's like, who cares? It really just shows how petulant Ty is and the fact that he is so hung up on this, to where this seems to completely burn Ty's relationship with Rob, to where he wants him out immediately following this, in a position where for Ty it makes no sense. I mean, for Zach getting rid of JM this week is really bad. This is essentially Ty doing the same thing of getting rid of someone that really wants to work with him. Rob had always wanted to work with Ty. Rob even brought Ty in on side deals that he was making, yet Ty targets him partially due to this is really stupid. But even beyond this, we also get this very awkward conversation as well, where Claudia mentions that she knows the bros are working together, to which Ty is so incensed at how she can know that he's like, oh, there's no way Claudia is smart enough to think of this plan. It must have come from Renee and Shania telling her, because they got it from Rob, because the women wouldn't be smart enough to think of this, which again, like, all this just came off very icky. And really just Ty just comes off as such a dick across this season. But beyond this, we do get to the power veto competition, which was an extremely physical one that really, again, favored the bro-y guys. And it does come down to Ty and Dan, to which Ty ends up winning, to which he was picked for the comp by Anika, and through that had made a deal for Anika, which I would say good self-preservation play from her, though at the same time, really bad play from Ty, especially considering the fact that he actually made this deal before he was even picked and was openly telling people about it, which is just burning relationships for no reason. But Ty does use the veto, and JM is eventually backdoored. I really did feel bad for JM here on his way out, where, again, I don't feel like he did that much wrong. Again, there is obviously passive play, and he probably didn't pick up on certain signs that he probably should have, but like, again, I don't feel like he did much wrong here. It just sucks to see this massive fan of the game being taken out, because he's the most threatening person outside of this bro-y group that came together. Though we do see a conversation between him and Santina, where he tells Santina that she was tricked, to which this actually causes Santina to regret making this decision. Even though, again, I already said it's not an entirely bad move, though through this causes Santina to make an even worse move, in that she later goes and openly talks about how she regrets the decision, and even starts to kind of campaign to keep JM around for a bit, which is just really suboptimal play at that point. But beyond that, JM did have a sliver of a chance of staying this week, with the women starting to talk about potentially working together and feeling like this bro group had finally lost a stranglehold on the game, despite really running it for the first week in real time. But again, with them targeting each other now, with Zach and Ty going for Rob, and then now here we see the girly pops and Claudia, Renee, and Shania talk about working with what would later be named the shady bunch of Kuzi, Anika, and Daniel, and then also Hope being someone that had a very good relationship with JM. It seemed like there was a potential for the numbers to be there, but again, it would have been very difficult to actually get all these groups together to go on the same page, especially considering Renee was on the block, and through that couldn't be one of those numbers as well. And really just as a whole, again, it was very unlikely the plan would come together, though again, it was cool to see people at least talking about it. But again, have respect for JM trying even on his way out. We do eventually get this unanimous JM vote, though I will say there was a little bit of humor through there being this fake out of Renee getting voted out, and like you just see the instant shock on her face. But again, JM still goes home, and again, JM is a player that I think there's still potential there. Again, I don't think he did that much wrong here. I think there is a decent player in him. I think he just needed a better cast, a cast that fits more in line with him, where again, it seemed like he had allies. It seemed like he was relatively close to the girly pops. He had a connection to like Kuzi and Daniel. He had a relationship with Hope. Like, he had relationships in there, but also, again, there were people that were obviously coming directly for him. Again, Santina and Anika never really trusted him. The bros obviously came for him, despite the fact that, like, for Zach, it made no sense for him to come for him. So again, like, there are knocks to have there, but I just don't know how much of that was due to anything JM actively did. And really, I just find it kind of sad that he wasn't really given that that much of a chance here. But with that, we move on to week 2, where we start off with an extremely physical basketball competition that goes on for 1 hour, which obviously continues to favor the bros, which it's like, why are we doing this? Especially because it's a comp also where like you can technically work for other people. You can pick up other players' balls and make shots for them, which really just gave the bros and the majority so much power here. Though thankfully it is here where we do learn that the dead last twist is over, so thank God for that. But obviously a bro ends up winning here, though to be fair, it is one of the bros not in the bro alliance, and that is Dan, who wins HOH here, with Rob coming in a very close second, which obviously would have led to a very different result for the week. And Hope also comes pretty close to winning, but doesn't because he would continue to go for the lower point shots, which really plays into Hope's state of mind across this week. But obviously here we see Dan being excited to be HOH, and too bad because he ends up wasting it. Where Dan really ended up playing a pretty bad game across this season, being one that, despite him having this connection to Zach, who seemingly was running things, Dan was still the number 1 target coming into this week. If he did not win this HOH, most people were going to target Dan. And through this HOH, he essentially just does whatever Zach tells him to, and what do you know? He comes out of this week also still the number 1 target for most of the house. It really just shows you how poorly Dan played this entire week. But again, we see Zach do the same thing that he did with Santina. Just manipulates Dan into thinking that Rob is coming after him, and through that gets Dan to agree to backdoor Rob in a position where, again, makes no sense for Ty in particular to be going along with this plan, despite him being one of the bigger advocates of it. Again, Rob was wanting to work with him. For Zach, it makes a little bit more sense in the fact that Rob was catching on to Zach, though at the same time, Rob wasn't going to go for Zach in the immediate future. But still, again, like, at least makes a little bit more sense there. But at the same time, obviously this is Zach controlling his second HOH in a row, putting a bigger target on his back. But even beyond that, also is getting rid of a massive potential shield for him in Rob, who's looked at as a big threat in the game as well. So again, just all around pretty bad play here. But we do see Dan taking Zach to Wendy's, during which we get the appearance of Chris Wiley from BB Can 8. Which was so random, though I audibly laughed at this. Again, the fact that he literally says, keep control of your brain, really makes me wish that we got to see more of Chris Wiley on BB Can. Really throughout this entire week, the Rob backdoor plan was going to go through. Beyond that here, we also get this subplot of Hope now being sad because of the HOH comp, feeling down that he let down the bros and his brother for not winning this basketball comp, where he had already been talking about potentially quitting the game due to how hard it had been on him. To which this has Hope coming out with the brilliant idea now of going to Dan and telling him to put him on the block. To which obviously Dan agrees to, though again, like right away the assumption was that he was doing this to send himself out. But the show tries to portray it as Hope doing this intentionally just so he can play in the veto, which to be fair, he does do beyond this. But I do think this initial time, 100% was because he was just not into the game. But again, this is just ridiculous, obviously. Like, even if it was that he wanted to play in the veto, it's still stupid to offer yourself up just so you can play in a competition, which obviously ends up backfiring when he does this moving forward. And it's funny that we do later see Hope regretting offering this up and goes to Dan and tells him that he doesn't want to go in the block anymore, which obviously Dan essentially tells him too late. But the noms do end up being Hope and Renee, with the backdoor plan of Rob being in place and Renee being pissed for one of many times across this season, which this incensed Renee across the season does end up being a fun aspect of her character to me. But also here we get some really strange play from Dan where he just tells Renee that she's the target for some reason, where like I don't get why he's lying to Renee in this situation. Like, I get it if you want to keep the Rob plan a secret, but also you're just telling someone that you're their target, meaning that they're going to come for you next time around. But either way, we get to the veto comp, which ends up being a pretty boring one that is sponsored by Philip Sonic Care, the one with 2 parts because they need to waste time on the show. And we have this like puzzle that determines the order that leads to one-on-one face-offs, and Hope ends up beating Renee, Kuzi, and Vanessa to get to the final round, to where he faces off against Zach, where Zach ends up beating him. Which, one, it's like, why did Zach win this? If Hope won the veto, he would have used it on himself, and the backdoor plan would have gone through anyway. So Zach winning this again just puts more of a target on his back. But also, there ends up being a lot of drama that stems from Zach winning the veto here. It really just paints the Rob move just further on his back, making people fully recognize how much he's controlling the game. But through that, there ends up being some drama that stems from this veto win as well. And first up is the fact that We have this argument between Ty and Zach over how dumb it was for him to win the veto. That also includes a fight over which of Dan and Claudia to keep for the following round, as Ty wants to get rid of Dan for really no reason. He says that Dan's going to flip the game on them, which is like, Dan Zabo? That's the person you're thinking is going to flip the game on you? But also the other bit of drama that stems from this veto win ends up being Hope just randomly being upset at Vanessa for some reason, where I guess he thought that Vanessa was helping Zach win the veto, which is like, why would she do that? But this ends up leading to Vanessa finally being on the show, where she seemingly has this breakdown here and her being so upset at how Hope could even think of this. However, it also ends up overhearing Zach calling her emotional, which leads to this massive blow up in the house where they get into a pretty big argument, leading to Vanessa saying that Zach is the guy that needs to try to be nice, which is funny, but she ends up calling him out for his treatment of JM, to which he calls her a sore loser, which is ironic much. But this all leads up to Vanessa revealing to the entire house that Zach has been trying to get rid of Rob, which I don't even know where Vanessa 100% got this from, where like I know Zach and Ty had been extremely sloppy and just openly talking to some people about how sketch they were of Rob, though again it's never fully explained like how Vanessa herself knew, where if this is Zach and Ty literally telling her that, that's really dumb on their end, though for some reason Rob doesn't seem to believe it, which is just kind of dumb, as we already had some content talking about how he was kind of sketched out by Zach. So the fact that he doesn't seem to believe this story ends up being kind of strange, but he does end up approaching Ty and Zach about this, to which Ty just laughs it off as a normal person would, only for Zach to freak out, being upset and saying that we'll chat tomorrow because I'm not in the mood right now, which again should have 100% alerted Rob that this was real, as like 100% this is just Zach buying himself time so he can think of what to say to him. But following this, we also get some great content between Zach and Santina, where now Santina has realized that how much Zach had been playing her and decides to start campaigning against Zach, telling Dan to not put Rob on the block and openly talk about how Zach is running the house, which again, good on Santina on figuring out what Zach is doing, but also really bad on Santina for openly campaigning against him in a position where this just causes her to become Zach's next target. Though again, we get this conversation between Zach and Santina where he calls her out on this, to which it is kind of just funny to see Zach, again, just like freaking out the first instance of something not going his way and someone questioning him. And we do see Santina telling Rob that he's going on the block, to which again, he just still doesn't believe it, still trusting in Ty for some reason. But here we also see John finally be on the show, to where he is essentially Rob's ride or die in this position, but he ends up questioning Zach about what Vanessa said, to which Zach is again just upset that he's being questioned, leading to a fight between the two, with Zach now saying that Rob is putting me in a difficult position. It's 100% like Zach trying to gaslight everyone to thinking that the reason why he's going for Rob is because of what Vanessa said in his response to it, when it's like you were targeting him for the last week anyway. And we do end the veto episode before the ceremony with this very strange cliffhanger of John talking about how he's upset that he's laying people down and that Rob is his brother and he means that. Talking about he doesn't know if he has it in him to fight this fight. And we literally end the episode on him saying wearing somebody's hat means something. It's like all this was just so dramatic, and seeing him give this speech and put so much gravitas into it was just kind of a interesting character moment to me, but also just really ridiculous that they actually made this the cliffhanger of the episode, especially considering in the following episode we don't even get that much that leads up to the eventual veto ceremony. I mean, we do get Zach telling Dan and Ty that they need to tell Rob that he's going on the block, but Zach doesn't want to be a part of it because he's in a bind. So then we do see Dan telling Rob that he's going up, to which obviously Rob fights back, trying to get Zach on the block, though I will say the overall campaign style of Rob, which is very strange, where he would never name names, like he never explicitly said Zach's name, which this lack of directness definitely did play a factor in to why some of his campaigns did not fully work. But even then, for Dan at this position, like I feel like at this point you kind of have to go all in. I mean, you've already let Rob know that you're willing to get rid of him. So again, he has to go through the move, and Zach does use the veto on Hope to backdoor Rob, during which we do get a very interesting vote, where it is in this position where right away we obviously have John and Santina being locked in votes for Rob, while Vanessa also pledges her loyalty to Rob, meaning that the swing votes here end up essentially being Kuzi, Daniel, Anika, and Hope, with Hope also later voting for Rob with no real explanation to it. By the way, Kuzi, Daniel, and Anika end up being the true swings here, to which this is the first point where we do see their alliance start to form. We do see Daniel and Anika have a final two and talk about riding the middle alongside Kuzi, and we do get this great one-on-one segment between Kuzi and Daniel with them agreeing to work together and them start talking game, only for them to realize that they went into the wrong bedroom, which was kind of humorous. But obviously this ends up being a big debate here between Rob and Renee, one that is very mixed here. Again, there is no real clear-cut decision, as it's not like either of them are going to be working with Zach moving forward, but they both bring something different to the table. I mean, Rob obviously brings physicality. Rob is someone that can win comps to take out Zach and can be used as a shield for them. However, at the same time, Rob is more likely to regroup with John, Hope, and Santina, while also has potential of even working with the guys once again down the road, to where there is some worry there. With Renee, there isn't the worry of her potentially blowing back on her down the road like there is with Rob. Obviously, she's not a shield for them in the way that Rob would be, but also not someone that is likely to win competitions to take out Zach for them. So again, it is a big debate here, though obviously they do end up deciding to vote out Rob, which again, I do think probably makes more sense long term. So you still have a lot of opportunities to take out Zach and Ty, and keeping another big threat in Rob in the game only makes it more likely that he is going to sneak his way through the game and win out a lot of comps towards the end. So again, I do understand their decision here, even though I'm not 100% where I personally would have leaned. Though this does end up leading to some drama once again, with John campaigning for Rob, to which Zach is upset that he's being campaigned against, because that's Zach for you, and we do get a fight between the two. But again, it all leads up to the Rob eviction. And again, Rob is another one that I don't know how much Rob necessarily does wrong here. Again, in week one, he seemed to be very well positioned, seemingly in the middle of the game, being parts of the Bros Alliance, but also having these offshoots with Shania and Renee. Also having just decent relationships with most of the house. Like, the fact that his game completely blows up over the course of that week is just kind of insane when you think about it, where, again, he's taken out by these people that 100% should have been keeping him in the game, both as a shield, but also as someone that trusted the likes of a Ty. So I don't really get decision making here and getting rid of Rob, though obviously there are faults in Rob's game. Again, his passiveness through the game and him not recognizing that he's being flipped on is bad. His overall campaigning, while seemed kind of effective at first, again, is kind of lackluster, with him not being very direct in talking about his long-term plans, and again, as a whole, not the greatest player in the world, but again, one that I don't think necessarily does that much wrong to end up being the second boot on this season, where it feels like he was being targeted by Zach and Ty, mostly because of their jealousy of him. Though obviously the move against Rob does end up causing the Bro Alliance to break, which does lead to the dynamic game that we see following this. But now for week 3, which ends up being a really crazy week, one that did lead to us losing out on digital dailies after Monday, which was an annoyance, though obviously after seeing what actually happened, it makes sense why they would shut them down. But first we do start the week with the reaction to the Rob vote, where people are confused over it being a 7-4 vote, with there being 2 hinky votes in that. Now right away, Vanessa gets called out, which was kind of humorous, but she continues to deny that she was the vote, which ends up really ruining her standing even more in the house, especially when she decides to throw Daniel under the bus for the vote, talking about Daniel is doing it because Zach told him to, which was just kind of a dumb rationale there. But eventually even the Hope vote ends up being blamed on Zach as well here. But again, Hope seems to somewhat get away with this pretty scot-free at the beginning. This all does lead up to another fight involving Vanessa, where Ty interrogates her over the rogue vote, to which, I mean, Ty did come off as a dick here, but again, Vanessa just continues to deny here, which no one believes, making her an easy pawn for most of the house, and even beyond that, an actual target for Ty. But eventually we do finally get to the HOH comp, which ends up being the typical roll your ball down a path, which Kuzi ends up winning here, in a position where I really feel like she shouldn't have won. I feel like this was definitely a bit of a misstep on her end to win this HOH, in a position where coming into this round she was perfectly positioned in the middle, with no one really coming for her, and Zach and Ty trusting her the most out of the people that they think that they're working with. However, through this HOH she really ends up exposing her hand and ends up making herself a bigger target, which I did feel like was largely unnecessary. But right away we do see Ty and Zach obviously be happy at Kuzi's HOH win, with Ty just openly saying, "I feel like I just won," really it's just, again, kind of an idiotic thing to say. But again, that's Ty for you. But following this, we do end up seeing the women finally coming together and deciding to make a move against the guys, where Cozy, Anika, Claudia, Shania, and Renee talk about flipping the house to weaken Ty and Zach. And I do feel like for Cozy, again, that would have been the optimal play when she won the HOH, to get rid of someone that is very close to Ty and Zach, but not get rid of Ty and Zach themselves. I mean, Ty and Zach are perfect shields for her, and also people that are working with her more than the other people in the house. I do feel like she very much should have targeted the likes of Dan or Santina, and actually she does target Santina here, with the women talking about wanting Santina on the block to disguise the fact that the women could be working together, which I don't think it really does at all, considering Santina was never part of that group, but whatever. But I do think a misstep comes from her wanting to use Vanessa as a pawn here. Obviously, Vanessa had put a target on her back, and using her as a pawn here makes a lot of sense. However, I do think the risk of losing Vanessa was something that Cozy shouldn't have risked. Now, obviously, Vanessa ends up leaving anyway, but keeping Vanessa in the game is a massive benefit for Cozy, as again, someone that Ty and Zach are looking at to target ahead of her, while also being someone that, again, like Cozy has a decent relationship with Vanessa. And there was talk about taking out Vanessa if the nominations had stayed the same, so I do feel like as a whole this did feel like a misguided play, where we do see her tell Ty about this plan, and Ty's instant reaction is to save Santina over Vanessa, though obviously it never really comes to that. But here we do see Cozy taking Daniel to Wendy's, to where she ends up formally introducing him to the Women's Alliance as well. And this is also where we get the naming of the Cozy, Daniel, and Nika final three, that being the Shady Bunch, who really end up controlling a lot of the action moving forward, despite some questionable play at points. Now, before nominations, we do get the return of the Bel Air direct safety, to which Jonathan ends up getting it this time, which ends up being kind of humorous, as Jonathan getting it this time kind of leads to Jonathan's downfall later in the game, which once again shows Canada's intentions kind of going against them. But either way, we get to the nominations, where we do get Santina and Vanessa on the block, which was a surprise to most of the audience at this point, as from the dailies that we had seen, we had known that Hope and Santina were on the block, not Vanessa. And we were under the assumption that Vanessa had won the Bel Air direct safety. However, that's all not the case, which was extremely confusing, and as we do later learn, it's because Vanessa had to leave the game, which ends up starting the following episode, which also seemed like the reason why there were no dailies, though that turned out to not be the case. But this ends up being another instance of this just kind of being glossed over in the edit. And losing Vanessa here, I mean, while it again sucks to lose anybody, I don't think it really played that much of a factor on this season. I mean, Vanessa didn't really seem to have much potential in the game. It felt like every instance of her trying to do something in the game, it would end up backfiring on her, and she never seemed to fit in with the overall house dynamics, to where she didn't really have any true alliances going on. No relationships for people that actually wanted to take her far into the game, and really I think getting rid of Vanessa here just kind of allowed for there to be one less easy week moving forward, where I don't think it really harmed the overall TV show, especially considering she wasn't super prevalent outside the times that she had her meltdowns. But obviously just in general, the concept of someone having to leave the game just sucks though, and does add to the train wrecking nature of this season. Beyond that, we do have Santina being confused over why she's on the block, being upset that Cozy isn't working with her, and talking about how one of the guys is now going to win the game, which is funny that it's Santina of all people that's complaining about someone letting the guys run the game. But through Vanessa having to leave the game, we do have Cozy having to name a replacement, to which she's only given 1 hour to do so, which felt very short. But this ends up being rectified pretty easily, with Cozy just asking Hope to go up on the block, and he's okay with it because that's Hope. But to be fair, this is also the nominations that Cozy probably should have gone with to begin with. Again, I think her playing Vanessa in danger was the suboptimal move. This kind of just course corrects it for her. Though here, we do see Zach being Zach and being upset that Hope's going on the block, as he personally wants Renee on the block instead, again showing him not getting his way, which how dare Zach not get his way. Though it is also here where we do see the Zach and Daniel relationship for the first time on the show, which is kind of a weird one, as again, like, I don't get how anyone is genuinely liking Zach in the house. It's such a strange concept to me. However, Daniel seemed to genuinely want to keep Zach around, not just because it benefits his game, but because he actually liked him as a person, which was weird. But eventually we do get to the veto pick, where we really get the worst possible veto pick here, where both Ty and Zach end up playing, making it very likely that one of the two are going to win the veto and ruin the plans here. However, that's thankfully stopped by Zach and Ty being idiots, to which they end up disagreeing over what to do with the veto, where Zach wants to take Santina out while Ty wants to save her, which in turn leads to them mutually agreeing to throw the veto, which is dumb, especially considering they needed it. Which, by the way, Zach also threw the HOH comp as well, which is also humorous, that he wins this extremely unnecessary week 2 veto, only to throw the 2 comps that he actually needed to win. By the way, we get to the veto comp where it ends up being another sponsored challenge for water filters, so yay, but Hope ends up winning the veto here, to which at this point, the plan to backdoor Zach is in full action. However, Daniel wants them to put up Dan instead, and straight up, they should have. Again, like for the Shady Bunch as a whole, it is the optimal move here to put up Dan and get Dan out. It weakens Ty and Zach without getting rid of one of the two, to where there's still this blatant target on Ty and Zach, while Ty and Zach still trust you, as again, getting rid of Dan doesn't really harm your overall relationship with them. So I do feel like this is the optimal move. However, even Daniel says here that it doesn't make game sense for them to get rid of Dan, which, why are you saying that if you're trying to pitch Dan to go home? And it really just comes off as Daniel playing emotionally here due to him wanting to keep Zach around, even though, again, keeping Zach around is actually their optimal play. By the way, we do have Ty and Kuzi eventually having a conversation where Kuzi lets him in on the fact that Zach might be going on the block, to which Ty obviously tells Zach and is shocked that he could be in danger, to where now their plan is to tell Hope to not use the veto on himself, keep himself on the block, to which Hope obviously says no, and they are shocked at this. Which, to be fair, Hope had been talking about quitting the game, and I do think they genuinely believe that and genuinely thought that Hope was a number for them that would be willing to lay down their sword for them, but obviously he doesn't, and I don't know why you should expect someone to actually do that. But again, that's Ty and Zach for you. But obviously we see the plan go through. Hope vetoes himself off the block, and Zach is eventually backdoored. However, it is at this point that we find out that a scandal has shocked the house, to which we get a brief preview to this, showing us the morning of the veto ceremony where Ty talks about having info that can get Hope DQ'd from the game, to where it turns out that this is actually the reason why the digital dailies had stopped. While I don't condone a lot of the actions that Ty and Zach make in the following episode, I will say the following episode is an all-time great episode of the show. I thought this was riveting TV from beginning to end. We're outside of these like really massive blindsides that happen along the way in BB Can. I do think this is probably one of the best episodes the show has ever had. By the way, the episode starts with Ty talking to Zach, with them revealing that Hope has snuck in a letter from outside and that he's been cheating in the game, and that they're going to use this information on the day before the eviction to get him kicked out. Which, I mean, there's a couple things to talk about here. First up, they really thought a letter would do this. They really thought a letter that came from the outside from before the season even started was enough to get him kicked out. I think that's kind of funny to begin with. But also, even beyond that, it's funny that they talk about how Hope has cheated when they themselves are also technically cheating, as it is against the rules to be using production as a strategy. And through this, they are essentially using their knowledge of production's rules as strategy to keep Zach in the game. So again, that was just kind of humorous. But immediately afterwards, we do see Zach being brought into the DR, where a producer ends up asking him what they're talking about, to which Zach finally reveals that Hope has this letter from his girlfriend, to which I love that the producer's reaction is, why didn't you tell us earlier? Which instantly should have alerted Zach to the fact that this probably isn't going to work out as well as you think it is. But while this is happening, we do have Ty confronting Hope immediately after the veto ceremony, which this did feel very icky. I mean, I feel like this was definitely rough to watch. It does very much like remind you just straight up bullying of Ty confronting Hope, being upset that Hope has been saying that Ty's been intimidating him, only for Ty to leave and Zach then enter the room, telling Hope to stop with all of his acting, and as Hope telling Zach that he feels intimidated, only for Ty and Zach to now come to him together and confront him again, obviously in an intimidating way, which just leads to a fight between the two, where Ty calls him a clown, and Hope gets up and Ty calls him aggressive, and like all this was just not particularly fun to watch. Obviously following this, Hope gets called to the DR to talk about the letter, during which Ty and Zach are their massive dicks in the background saying peace, brother, while watching him walk in. And this is where we do learn about the way that the letter got brought in the fact that he didn't even bring in the letter himself, which makes this all even more ridiculous. I mean, it's not even a letter that Hope intentionally snuck into the house. It's one that his girlfriend put into one of his socks in the luggage that production themselves brought into the house. Meaning this is actually more production's fault than it is Hope's. And obviously, yes, it is against the rules for Hope to then not bring it to production immediately after he finds it, but it is still really dumb that there was ever this true conversation about how this would actually end up expelling Hope from the game. But we do see Hope immediately freaking out over the fact that he might be kicked out of the game. And I did love seeing the other players come to Hope's defense here, and them obviously recognizing that Zach and Ty are obviously using this to their own game benefit and calling them out for that. To where we do get this big fight with Kuzi. That was just fantastic TV here, where, again, Ty just comes off as a massive dick at the beginning here, where he's talking about how he's not trying to be intimidating as he's, like, standing above Kuzi with his shirt off. Again, clearly trying to come off as intimidating. Well, this leads to a great sequence of events with Kuzi telling him that you're next, and then gets into a fight with Zach over if it was cheating or not, which, to fully clarify here, is it cheating? Kind of. I mean, again, it is technically against the rules. However, do I think it should have had major ramifications? No, because it's like, who cares? Again, this 100% just feels like Zach obviously knowing that he's lost and trying to find every little way to potentially stay, and also him just being kind of pissed off at Hope for not helping him stay, because that's Zach for you. Now again, I do understand what Zach has said after the fact, that it's not the letter itself, it's the fact that Hope used the letter to manipulate me and Ty into working with him, which it's like we're really saying Hope is the person that's doing this? And all this comes off even more hypocritical when we learn later in the season that Ty and Zach had a deal the entire time to share the money, which is even more of an infraction on the rules than Hope's letter. So again, all this is just really stupid, and again, just really shows you Zach and Ty's true colors here. Again, it was never about the actual cheating. It's just that they were sore losers for having gotten outplayed in this situation. Though again, Zach and Ty feel very adamant in the fact that this is cheating, and if they don't rule on their side, they're gonna walk. Which is where this episode gets very interesting. As again, knowing that the digital dailies have been gone, this is the point where you realize, oh, they've been down because probably someone's gonna walk from the game. But first we do end up seeing the players being told to go to the living room, where we do have Arissa doling out the punishment for Hope, with him being stripped of his vote for this following round, and also not being able to play in the next HOH. Again, stripping him of his vote, that's fine. To be honest, that's exactly what Ty and Zach were essentially trying to do, is to gain this advantage for Zach to potentially stay in this round. But again, for him to also not be able to play in the next HOH felt a bit harsh. But also beyond that, they decide to also give everyone their letters from home to make it fair, as Hope had one as well, which I will say this part of it also was a question mark to me, where I feel like this was kind of the opposite, in it being very gracious, and it essentially now actually glorifying Hope, in that now it's because of Hope that everyone got their letters from home. So where we do see Ty and Zach be frustrated at this immediately afterwards, which again, I can get that. I do think that's probably the only aspect of all this that I can kind of see where Zach and Ty are coming from. But at the same time, the fact that they still want to quit here, despite the fact that they, again, essentially got what they wanted and them coming a step closer to surviving, is pretty ridiculous. But again, we do see Zach still want to walk, though they're not going to walk just yet, because Zach wants to try to stay in the game, which again just makes this even more apparent what they're doing here. Again, they're essentially wanting to walk because they lost, and Zach is just a massive sore loser and seemingly can't take the fact that he has lost the game. As again, if it was truly about the accusations of cheating and everything, they would have just left here. However, the fact that, again, they stay and again, supposedly also come very close to flipping the vote, again, just fully shows you Zach's entire rationale here. So I will say again, like, to me, it is pretty insane here that Zach and Ty seemingly almost pull over Shania and Claudia to their side, where Shania openly talks about after this that she did want to keep Zach around. However, Claudia is the one that eventually doesn't go through with the plan, which again, after all their actions of this week, it's insane to me that they actually came somewhat close to staying. By the way, also here we do get some drama from the fact that Daniel seems to still be supporting Zach, which again, like, I don't get what Daniel is doing here. And what's the fact that most people in the house, especially his closest allies, all seem to be extremely anti-Zach. I did feel like it was extremely misguided for him to still be supporting Zach, which again just felt like a purely emotional move there, though he continues to refuse to vote Zach out in a position where, again, if Shanae and Claudia had flipped, his vote would have been very integral. But we do get to the night before the formal eviction where Claudia does end up telling Zach that he's going home, to which he obviously says that this isn't fair, and he proceeds to then want to leave, to where we see him telling Ty that we have to go. Ty seemingly instantly is on board of this, to where they start walking to the DR, and this once again seems to just be dickish behavior from both Ty and Zach, essentially putting their quit onto Shania and Claudia, essentially putting this burden on them for them quitting the game in this way. But we do have them proceeding to go to the DR, where we see Ty finally start to regret it. And the funniest thing to me is that we see Zach trying to convince Ty to go through with quitting the game, to which Ty responds with saying he thinks we're taking this too seriously and that's only a game show, to which Zach is obviously appalled, though he ends up self-evicting here. And again, this was just such a glorious sequence of events. I mean, to be fair, it probably would have been even more glorious had Ty also quit, but still, this massive downfall for Zach, this guy who had run the first 2 weeks of the game, and for him to face adversity for the first time and instantly crumble to the point where he quits the game is just so hilarious to me. I know a lot of people were upset online over production having cast a quitter, though again, I feel like this was just such perfect storytelling for how Zach should have left the game. But again, with that, we do have Ty deciding to stay in the game. That's not the end of the episode just yet, as we then need to cut to Arissa, who strangely tells the players the prize for the season, which was very awkward that we just radically shifted tone like that at the end of the episode. But still, overall, fantastic week here. Great episode. One where we lost Zach, who again is just such a dislikable player on this season. Again, like, he is this massive villain for the show, but one that, again, I did find fun to watch. While there were certainly points that were pretty icky with him in there, I do feel like most of the time I just never took Zach seriously and just looked at him as this like cartoonish villain on the show. And for him to find his comeuppance here and going out in this pretty pathetic way of quitting the game, I just felt like all that was so glorious to me. I do feel like Zach's downfall is really one of my favorite aspects of this season, and how he really just comes off as this massive sore loser at the end. And really, it doesn't take away anything from the actual show either, because like, again, he was going to get evicted anyway, and this was the eviction episode anyway, so it doesn't harm the pacing of the show. It doesn't really affect the overall schedule. I think it just made for great TV. So again, I personally didn't mind the quit here, as I did feel like it made the show actually better, really emphasizing Zach's villainy across the season. Now for week 4, which ends up being a bit of a weird week, where the gameplay of it is pretty stagnant in terms of the overall results, though there is a lot of interesting shifting dynamics across the week that kept it somewhat interesting. Though I do feel like a lot of the flaws of this week come from the fact that it is whodunit week, where we get the reveal that the HOH and the veto here will be played anonymously, which I still don't love this twist. Obviously, we had this invisible HOH in BB Can 9, and I didn't feel like it worked out there, and I don't feel like it worked out here. I just do not think this is a good concept. I think invisible HOHs just make it very hard for players to actually play when they don't know who they should be catering to. And while you can make the argument that, okay, they should be catering towards everybody, I feel like it still just doesn't make for good TV, as usually people aren't going to just cater towards everybody. And usually just the overall decision making ends up being kind of stagnant, as we do see here. Now, for the HOH-Con, we obviously see the fallout of the Zach quit, to which we get this great moment of Renee talking about how she's ready to play and you're never going to see me quit, only for them to then cut to Zach's photo, which just really felt like the editor's taking a dig at him there. But finally, we get the HOH, which ends up being an interesting HOH-Con, one that felt very reminiscent of old school Big Brother, and the fact that essentially the players were tempted with how much they wanted this prize, where we get the reveal that the prize money has increased by 50 $50,000. And the players are now asked how much of that money they're willing to give away to purchase the HOH, with only the one that bids the most being the HOH, unless there's obviously a tiebreaker, though the unspent money will be left for the prize, which 100% they always knew that someone was going to bid $50,000, as again, I can guarantee you they were not willing to spend extra money due to this comp. And while this comp did take up a lot of time on the show, I did still find this to be an interesting comp to watch. The one that it feels like almost everyone played wrong. Like, I don't think anyone actually made a sensible decision throughout a lot of this, where right away we do see people like Daniel and Renee and Claudia and Shania not even bet all the money, which it's like, well, you know, at least somebody is going to bet the 50,000. So why not just go all in? Unless you don't want to win HOH, which we do hear Daniel not want to, which at that point, why not just put in 0 to guarantee you're not going to be HOH? And I did find it humorous also that like Renee initially decides to go 22,000, only they're saying, no, I'm changing it to 24,000, which makes no difference. Even for the people that went with 50,000, again, the tiebreaker ends up being the average bid, to which I don't get what most of these people were doing with that answer either. To where we see multiple people go 49,999, which I guess they were just under the assumption that everyone would go with that. But that seems extremely misguided. We see Jonathan going 25,000, which I don't get how he thought it would be that low. And Santina here ends up winning with 49,000, which is not even that good of an answer. As again, if you're already assuming that someone isn't going to go for 50,000, that more than likely will bring the average down more than just 1,000. So again, the answer probably should have been somewhere in the 40 to 45,000 range. But again, like all these answers made no real sense. I did find some fun character moments throughout a lot of this challenge as well, though, with us getting to see Kuzi and Hope's reactions to the comp, to which Hope then mocks the invisible HOH, though continues to say invincible HOH. We also see Hope getting up to hug Renee, to where Kuzi gets upset that he isn't being regal enough. You also get Jonathan struggling with reading the card, to where he can't read out who done it, which was funny. So again, like I thought this was a fun enough comp, even though it went on for a while, though it all leads up to Santina becoming the invisible HOH here, to which immediately following this, she ends up acting terribly, to where it should have been extremely obvious that she was an invisible HOH, though it did seem like a lot of the cast didn't pick up on it, instead blaming Dan or Renee for having the HOH instead, though we do see Santina telling John about her power, which she ends up not doing that much with. Though again, we do get a lot of talk about the speculation of who's the HOH, which is another big downside of this twist in my mind, where again, it just feels like instead of talking about what's actually happening this week, we end up getting a lot of talk about who could have won the HOH, who could have won the veto. And again, that doesn't really matter. But anyway, Santina still gets Wendy's and her winner's outfit in the DR because we needed that, obviously. And we see Kiefer be there at Wendy's, to where he gives her good advice, only for her to then not take it. Where really this entire HOH ends up being this massive wasted opportunity for Santina, where in the aftermath of the Zach quit, again, the game was completely in shambles, to where Santina should have been able to use this HOH to gain control of the game. However, it is during this week where the Crown ends up forming, this alliance of Hope, John, Anika, Daniel, and Kuzi, to which there's no reason why Santina shouldn't have been part of that alliance, especially considering it was John and Hope that were the ones that created the alliance, who were close to Santina. And really, instead of Santina benefiting her position here, really the Shady Bunch end up completely running the game at this point, where they end up being in the center of all the groups, with Daniel and Anika's positioning in particular being extremely good here, with Kuzi having become a bigger target due to the previous week, and also having talked on the digital dailies about cutting her before the end, which did very much increase their win equity. But also, this entire week also ends up being a massive wasted opportunity for the girly pops as well, who were initially in that position to play the middle, where after Kuzi had made the move against Ty and Zach, it ended up shifting a lot of the power to the girly pops, with them being in the center of the house. However, they very much end up siding with Dan and Ty, to which they end up losing that positioning, and through that the Shady Bunch end up taking power over them here, which really felt like a fall from grace for Claudia in particular, who seemed to be in such a great position coming into the week. However, Santina here talks about wanting to make a big move by going for Ty and Dan, the two people that almost everyone in the house would have gone for, which I don't get how this is really a big move, especially when it's a move that doesn't really even benefit her. I mean, taking Dan out is fine. I mean, she didn't really have that much of a relationship with Dan, and while Dan could have been used as a shield, again, it's not entirely bad. However, her deciding to put Ty on the block was definitely extremely questionable, though initially she wasn't going to, because Ty decided to threaten that if he went on the block that he would quit, because I guess that's Ty for you. Though obviously he doesn't end up going through with it. But here we get the setup of the Dan and Shania showmance, which is probably one of the most boring showmances in the show's history. But either way, we get to the noms where Dan and Ty go up, and Renee has this really over-the-top reaction, I guess seemingly due to the fact that she thought Dan was the HOH, but this really ends up putting a lot of eyes onto her, with people thinking that she's the invisible HOH due to her overacting, with Dan explicitly calling her out for this, and Santina deciding to pile on, and continuously declaring that she can't be the HOH because she wouldn't put Ty up. To which, again, she's saying this to Dan, to which Dan then questions her, well, would you have put me up? Which all this was just super sloppy play from Santina. But Renee being accused here ends up leading to her being pissed. To which she finally talks about how she has to spend the rest of the day unpissing herself. Though she ends up doing it in a really confrontational way here that really ends up ostracizing herself even more from the house, to where by the end of this week, she was one of two consensus targets for the following round. But even beyond that, we see Renee's interactions with Santina, where Renee seems to pick up on the fact that Santina is actually the HOH and ends up growing more annoyance for her. And while again, all terrible gameplay from Renee here, I did find it to be a fun character moment for her. But following this video, we get to the veto, which again will be an invisible veto, which is the first time that's happened in BB Can history. And again, like it's kind of similar to HOH. I do think it's just a less interesting version than the real veto. I don't think anything would have changed had this been a public veto. But here we do see Daniel winning the comp, to which he then talks about wanting to use the veto on Ty to repair his relationship with Ty, though initially is worried of doing so as he doesn't know who the replacement would be and obviously worries that it would be one of his alliance members, only for us to then conveniently have John walk into the room, to where he then reveals to the alliance that Santina is the HOH and that Claudia would be the replacement nom, which conveniently gives the Shady Bunch all the information they need to make this move, which is a good move for them. I know there was a lot of discourse online about people being upset that they saved Ty, when in reality, again, Ty was staying anyway. It was Dan that was going to go home no matter what. And really, this is a move that, again, just gains favor from the Shady Bunch. This puts them even more in the middle position, where this allows them to create a backup alliance with Ty and Claudia, essentially putting them in a position higher than John and Hope, who now have to worry about Ty potentially targeting them moving forward. To where this obviously makes you question, why did John and Hope agree to this, to which they obviously reluctantly do, but it does feel like they're pretty much just outplayed by the Shady Bunch here, being convinced that keeping Ty and the Shady Bunch having control of Ty is good for the entire group, when in reality it's really only good for the Shady Bunch. But anyway, we do have the plan go through, where Ty gets vetoed off, Claudia is the replacement, and Claudia is shocked to be on the block, to where she now thinks that it was Renee that did it, which I don't get how. Like, none of this makes sense. However, this does lead to Claudia deciding to target Renee for the next few days, which was just really dumb gameplay. Now, I will say I do think Claudia does decent work in campaigning. Again, she does build this final five with the Shady Bunch and Ty. She seems to gain favor of Kuzi across this week. Like, she does do good work, but the fact that it's all based around the fact that she's extremely anti-Renee at this point is really ridiculous. But again, there was never really any doubt that Dan wasn't going to go home here. Though again, we still get some intrigue along the way from the Shady Bunch again doing good work and turning Ty against Santina now, where while we never truly see this, I think it's easy to assume that they probably told Ty about Santina being the HOH, where out of nowhere Ty seemingly knows that Santina is the HOH and directly comes for her, to where that greatly benefits the positioning of the Shady Bunch. But even beyond that, we do see Renee also confronting Santina, leading to this big fight in front of the entire house, to where pretty much everyone is calling out Santina for being the HOH. Which, the fact that Renee starts this fight, and for some reason by the end of the week is being lumped in with Santina as like a duo that's working together, was really ridiculous and really made no sense either. But again, Dan was pretty screwed here, though he does do a last second campaign of trying to campaign against Ty after he finds out that Ty had actually been targeting him the previous week. Though it obviously doesn't go through, and he gets voted out unanimously here, being the first member of the jury somehow, which felt very weird that the jury started with Dan being the third person person to be formally evicted, with there obviously being 3 walks before him, which was just weird. And again, I fully would have expected the jury to start at least a round later, to where you would have a Canada's vote, or maybe even 2 rounds later, to where you just have a 7-person jury. But for some reason, they decided to go with a big 9-person jury here, which was just strange. But either way, we lose Dan, who was just kind of bland. I didn't particularly find him that interesting, which is weird considering he actually gets a decent amount of screen time on the show, like confessional count wise. He is on the higher side of things, largely because of his HOH week, but he really just did not seem to be that invested in the game. He definitely came off very underwhelming to me, where I thought in the preseason he seemed to have a decent amount of potential, with him seeming to be the guy that did the most research out of the recruits, though he really just comes into the game and just follows Zach for a lot of it, in a position where Zach was willing to cut him down the road if he had to, and just really never seemed to have any true solid allies. And again, personality-wise, he was also kind of bland, to where, again, I just didn't find him that interesting on the show. But with that, we move on to week 5, which ends up being a great week of the show, but largely due to a twist, where if it wasn't for that, it would have been extremely straightforward. But obviously, first we start off with the HOH, which ends up being an endurance comp, kind of similar to Baba Booey from Survivor, though the challenge itself did seem to be relatively easy, where Ty and Hope, these 2 massive guys, end up making it 5 hours here in a comp that you would think wouldn't favor them to begin with. But I will say, I did find it kind of weird that they allowed Santina to compete in this HOH, which obviously, like, due to the fact that she was invisible and the type of comp that this is, it is kind of tough to enforce her throwing the HOH comp without alerting that to other people, though still kind of a weird ruling in my mind. But also here we do get Wendy's deciding to spice up the competition by offering up 5,000 Wendy's points to drop, to which no one seems to actually care, though Kuzi decides to throw the comp here and use this as an excuse for it, though this seems to have the opposite ramification of people actually taking offense to this, with people talking about how she feels too comfortable in the game, which does seem to plant a bit of a target on her back. But again, by the end of the comp, it is Ty versus Hope, with the tiebreaker of only using 1 arm, to which Ty ends up winning it at the end, to which again, at this point, it should have been a very easy week. But pretty much everyone coming into this week was planning on nominating Renee and Santina, with Santina as the very obvious target. Ty was one of the most gung-ho people on that plan, though we do have a couple things come up along the way. First up is the fact that Ty, for some reason out of nowhere, decides to not put Renee on the block right away, instead want to put up Hope next to Santina instead, I guess probably to have better chances at winning the veto. But this obviously leads to him asking Hope to go on the block, to which Hope instantly says yes, because that's Hope for you. Though this time it actually does backfire on him, though to be fair, I think Ty probably would have done it anyway, even if Hope said no. But also here we do get a lot of drama surrounding Santina that was just really funny, where straight up, I mean, this is Santina coming off as largely unlikable, but it was just a really humorous character moment here, where we start off with Anika making toast, to which Santina gets her piece and complains about it being soft and gives it back, where that starts off the tension, though later we see Anika cooking breakfast, to which Santina then sniffs her waffle and talks about how it's not good, saying it's tasteless, and this leads to this massive fight between Anika and Santina. That was just so funny. Now, straight up, again, this is 100% Santina just being rude to Anika. Again, Anika is in this position where Dan was the house cook and just got evicted, so Anika tried to take over for that, and was also in a position where they didn't have the right ingredients, and openly said that coming into it. Which, to be fair, that context wasn't on the show, but I do feel like Santina definitely was not acting the greatest here, but it did make for fun TV to see these two bickering over the waffles, and then later fighting over who was rude, with Santina saying, "I don't even want your breakfast, rude ass," saying, "Your waffles suck, I don't need your tasteless waffles," and like all that was just really funny to me. But through that, Santina seems to know that she's probably going on the block and is probably going home if she doesn't win the veto. That is until we get the reveal that for the final time this season, the Bel Air Direct Protection is up for grabs, to which Santina wins safety here, which this time it actually affects the game. And finally, again, another fan vote that ends up backfiring on Canada, where through Santina being safe here, this obviously later leads to John going home, putting John in danger, who was one of Canada's favorites, while also Ty, who I assume is one of Canada's least favorites, ends up being forced to make a move that's more so in his best interest than what he was originally going to do, where his targeting of Santina was a pretty bad move initially, but the fact that he was stopped from doing that and was instead forced to target one of the Crown ends up actually being a better move for him. So again, all that's kind of funny, but we do get to the nominations, where now the nominations end up being Hope and Renee, with Renee now being the target. It is fine, though we do get a lot of focus on the Girly Pops, with them seeming to fully turn on Kuzi at this point in the game, something that did kind of come out of nowhere. Now, it does seem like they just genuinely recognized how well positioned Kuzi was, where Ty seemed to be unwilling to even look at Kuzi as a target, despite the fact that Kuzi took out Zach, his number one ally, being worried that she hasn't gone on the block and got no blowback from that HOH. And we do have Claudia campaigning to get Kuzi on the block, only for that to go nowhere, though finally during one of these sequences, we do have Kuzi turning out to be in the bathroom, though she doesn't seem to overhear anything, but Ty is concerned that she overheard anything, and decides to just leak to Kuzi everything about Claudia's conversation in an attempt to keep Claudia safe, which I don't get how you're doing that when you're ratting out Claudia, but either way, this obviously has Kuzi now wanting to take out one of the Girly Pops, further cementing this target on Renee, who to be fair was going to go home in this situation anyway. But this is where we do get to the veto draw, where Ty, again, is targeting Renee and gets house guest choice, and in his infinite wisdom decides to pick Shania, the only person that would end up saving Renee, which was just so stupid. I mean, he says that he made this decision because he didn't want to expose his hand and who he's working with, namely Kuzi, but like, you have to pick Kuzi. You could have picked Anika. You could have picked Daniel. You could have even picked Jonathan. Like, literally, Shania is the worst possible person to pick here, and through that, this actually gives Renee her best possible outcome, with essentially the people playing in the veto here being everybody but the Crown, with Hope being the only Crown member to even play. But this was a really idiotic play here from Ty, one that, again, really just shows his overconfidence in the game, where he talks to Kuzi immediately afterwards and tells her that he's confident that he can get Shania to not use the veto if she wins it, and talks as if he's completely running the entire house, which is just idiotic considering he's very clearly on the bottom. But we eventually get to the veto, which ends up being another sponsored one by Bel Air Direct, which ends up being a bit of a weird comp here. That's a series of head-to-heads, though each head-to-head is different than the next, which also with 5 people in the comp, that essentially means that Hope has to go twice before the final round, which didn't really make much sense. But it does end up leading us to our best possible outcome here in Shania winning the veto, with Shania being pretty resolute in taking Renee off the block, in which Jonathan will be the replacement, and through that, Crown member will be forced to go home. However, we do see some players go to some drastic measures here to have the veto not be used, particularly Ty, who is essentially doing this against his own best interest, where again, Ty should 100% be wanting Jonathan or Hope to go home. They are 2 people who are directly coming for him, and even beyond that are 2 people that are in the main majority alliance. However, he still wants Renee out for some reason, and goes to the measures of threatening Shania with putting up Claudia if she uses the veto, which is really ridiculous. I mean, this is a situation where Claudia would have 100% gone home had she been on the block. The Crown had the numbers to keep any of their members safe had it not been 2 of their members on the block. So again, this was just insane to see him potentially take out his own showman. And while he doesn't go through with it, I mean, this does obviously really harm the relationship between Ty and Claudia, and does piss off the Girly Pops to the point where they are directly targeting him following this. But also here we see the Crown themselves create this plan where they decide to wait until an hour before the veto ceremony to then essentially strong-arm Shania into not using the veto, revealing to her that no one wants her to use the veto, which this is really terrible gameplay as well. Now, I will say the thing that's kind of funny about this is I do think this could have been effective had they done this earlier in the week. And the fact that they wait until an hour before the veto ceremony is really terrible, as it obviously gives Shania no time to actually think about it. But also even beyond that, it just comes off as so transparent what they're trying to do here. It makes it so obvious that this isn't in Shania's best interest to keep Renee around, and they are doing this for their own personal reasons. So I felt like all this was extremely sloppy play from the likes of Kuzi in particular, who seemed to be the one that created this plan. But anyway, we get to the veto, where Shania does end up using the veto on Renee still, where Ty ends up nominating Jonathan as the replacement, which is, again, what he should have done to begin with. But this ends up leading to a really emotional eviction episode, one that is really filled with a lot of the crown, feeling like they're holding this funeral for one of their own, where Hope and John are just crying for most of it, not knowing what to do in this position. Though I will say, I also didn't love how the crown responded to all this, where, again, like, I get that you're emotional, that one of your own has to go home, and that's purely fine. However, I didn't love the fact that they continue to talk about this as if Shania made a bad move for her game, and that this is all Shania's fault. When, again, like, to me, there's no doubt that Shania should have made this move. Again, losing Renee is definitely a major blow to Shania's game, being a loyal ally to her, while also being a target in front of her, while also being one of the only people that is actually being purely genuine to her. So also through this, we do see Ty being upset at his plan not going through because of Shania. Again, being upset that Renee got to Shania's head and put him in a bad spot, which it's like, yeah, it's definitely Renee's fault for all this, not the fact that you picked Shania for the veto to begin with. But also here we do see the girly pops being confused at the reaction to the veto, to where Ty once again ends up showing how much of a dick he is, with him being upset at Claudia for defending Shania in this situation, and this ends up leading to them breaking up, I guess, which was just kind of an awkward segment on the show. But really, this also like should 100% show the girly pops how rough a position there are in the game at this point, and the fact that they seemingly are so aloof to the overall house dynamics here. But with that, we also get this awkward moment of Santina congratulating Renee in this situation, which did feel very much like Santino's trying to pick a fight with them. But beyond that, we do get the setup to the eventual vote, where John ends up telling Kuzi and Daniel that he's thankful for everything that they did for him, and he essentially lays down his sword here. Now, he does go on and campaigns for himself down the road, but I do feel like Jonathan definitely didn't feel like he had the gusto that you would have expected from him in order to stay. And we do initially see the Shady Bunch decide to keep Hope around, seemingly due to the fact that Hope was better in competitions, had more potential to be an asset for them later on, while John also just openly talks about how he's going to be working for them in the jury, so that's obviously a nice person to have in the jury as well. Though I will say, I personally do feel like I would have kept Jonathan in the game. I do feel like keeping Hope around is more of a wild card, someone that you never know what he's going to do in terms of his relations with someone like a Santina and a Ty, and the fact that he continuously offers himself for the block, and like he makes these moves that don't really make sense, while John is a much more rational player, a lot more loyal of a player as well, to where while he does have these connections to the girls, which puts him in a very good position had he stayed, he also was someone that was actively going to cut those girls in order to keep the Shady Bunch around. So I do think the overall decision making here was a bit questionable in my eyes. Though we do see the Shady Bunch also just kind of waver throughout this week as well, where we do see Hope make this comment about him being worried that John's going to expose the crown, to which Kuzi and Anika end up being really upset at him for, which I didn't really get, though this supposedly does lead to them now recognizing that Hope could be a wild card and talk about potentially taking him out, to which they end up gathering the women together, to where for a second it seemed like this women's alliance was going to come back together to all target Ty for the following round, only for Renee to kind of ruin everything, where again, this wasn't on the show, but Renee during this conversation did essentially tell Kuzi and Anika how upset she is at the fact that they clearly want her gone this week, to the point where Anika and Kuzi realize that there's no working with the girly pops anymore, and through that end up flipping back to wanting to keep Hope around. However, this entire week really all comes down to Santina, where the show doesn't even properly portray this, as they never even really focus on Santina's vote. However, Santina was the swing vote here. And even in this position where the Shady Bunch had sided with Hope, as they eventually do, it's still a 3-3 vote, as the girly pops still wanted to keep Jonathan around, meaning that Santina was the swing. And kind of an unreported story here is the fact that, again, Jonathan seems to just kind of give up in a way here, where Santina blatantly says to him that she's willing to keep him around as long as Jonathan tells her that he wants to stay, to which he doesn't really give her a proper response to it. And we do see Kuzi do effective work here, pulling in Santina, essentially replacing Jonathan with Santina in the Shady Bunch, which doesn't really last that long, but it essentially does lead to Santina siding with the Shady Bunch in this vote, in voting out John over Hope, which is something that, again, isn't really shown on the show, which I did find very strange about all this. But Jonathan gets this really emotional exit from the game, one that, again, I think just really shows you how good of a person Jonathan seems to be. I mean, Jonathan just seems to be the nicest person to ever play this game. I do think to a degree that I don't know if he has a great player within him where, again, he's such a nice, affable guy that if he makes it to the end, I think he would have a lot of win equity. But at the same time, I just don't see this like killer instinct in him. While he is willing to flip on people once they flipped on him, I do feel like he is someone that is blindly loyal to a fault and isn't willing to make the moves that he would probably need to make in order to gain some respect for his game. Now, as evident by the fact that in his exit interviews, he was talking about how he would have taken Kuzi to the end despite the fact that he thought he would have a tough chance at beating her. But again, he still comes off as a largely affable person, seems to be one of the nicest people in the game, and his perpetuity for making these very dramatic speeches did also make him a somewhat fun character in my mind as well. But now for week 6, which does end up being a bit of a strange week here, one that does surprisingly start off with the HOH comp actually being in the episode, which is a near miracle for BB Can, which actually continues surprisingly. But here we do get a knockout competition, which, despite the fact that the show never properly portrayed the game dynamics at this point, to where I feel like for the casual viewers, the result of this comp, it being Kuzi versus Claudio, is not looked at as that suspenseful. In reality, it was, considering coming into this round, Kuzi and Claudio were coming after each other. Here we do have Kuzi winning the actual HOH here, but the Girly Pops seeming like they were going to be in danger until they weren't. By the way, it is also here we get the reveal that this week's going to be a bit different because on the Tuesday night episode, we're going to be having the Fatal Feast where someone's going to go home, which ends up leading us to a very strange Tuesday episode, one that pretty much entirely comprises of the Fatal Feast and the events leading up to it, though also ends up being a pretty weirdly edited episode, as is one that actually contains no DRs. A massive rarity for Big Brother in circumstances outside of premieres, to where, while it did feel a bit strange here, I did think it overall allowed for some really great editing, especially in the first half of the episode here, of allowing us to stay in this tense situation, us getting to see the events play out naturally. Before we get to that, we do have some talk about Kuzi's potential nominations, where, again, despite the fact that Kuzi seemed to be targeting the Girly Pops coming into her HOH, by the time the next day, she seems to be completely off that plan for some reason. Now instead, wanting to get rid of one of Ty or Santina, considering them bigger threats in the game than the Girly Pops, which is just really ridiculous to me. Now, I think Ty, while not an ideal target, is not one that is ridiculously bad in the fact that at least he is good at comps and he is a massive wild card, while Santina, to me, is quite possibly the worst possible target for Kuzi in this position, where again, Santina is someone that is this massive target in the game, someone that everyone else is going to be willing to get rid of over Kuzi, while even beyond that is someone that is actively wanting to take Kuzi to the end and would end up losing to Kuzi. So the fact that Kuzi goes out of her way here to make Santina the backup plan and want her out in the case that Ty wins a comp is pretty insane to me. But surprisingly, the only person that seems to have sense within the crown during this round of wanting to keep Ty and Santina and go after Girly Pops is Hope, where Hope has a lot of questionable strategic thoughts across the game, but it's funny to me that in his eventual boot week here, he probably plays the best that he had played the entire season, with him trying to convince Kuzi of doing what is actually in her best interest here. By the way, the main events of this episode do start with Daniel entering the library during the morning, to which the lights start to flicker and books start to fall, with obviously this recognition that it is now time for the secret of the library to be found, to which Daniel and Anika end up searching the room while Hope ends up blocking the door, which ends up being a pretty controversial aspect of all this. Though, again, I did really like the editing of this sequence, it being extremely raw and us seeing Santina looking for Daniel and not being able to find him, and then she goes and asks Ty about his location, to where Ty at this point knows what's going on and ends up barging through the room, with Hope also letting Santina in eventually as well, and later letting Kuzi in, to where the only people that aren't in the room are the Girly Pops, to where the Girly Pops try to push the door, however Hope doesn't budge, to which they end up being upset that they're not let in, to which they end up sulking outside. And obviously there's two trains of thought on what goes on here. Obviously there's the camp that feel like the Girly Pops should have tried harder to get into the room, to which I personally don't really know what you really wanted them to do, as again, they literally pushed the door with all three of them and Hope still didn't move through that situation. There are people mention that, oh, they let Ty and Santina in, but also Ty is this massive guy that literally knocked Hope out of place when he barged into it, while Santina is someone that Hope is trying to save in the game. Well, Hope doesn't have any incentive to let the Girly Pops in. So I personally don't really have an issue with what the Girly Pops end up doing here. But also there's this camp of people that are upset at the people inside the room for leaving the girls outside. However, I also don't really have that much of an issue with that either. I mean, I do in the sense that it's bad gameplay to just actively let the girly pops know that they're essentially on the bottom through them being the only ones not allowed in the room. However, again, I do feel like it was done entirely from a game standpoint, not due to them trying to bully the girly pops in this situation. But really, to me, more of the fault ends up going to production. I do feel like production should not have allowed this sort of thing, especially if this was a circumstance where there actually was a power inside the room. Mind you, if there was a power, the door would have been locked, so it really is a moot point anyway. But again, I don't personally have an issue of Hope blocking the door. I feel like that's within his right as long as the producers don't declare it against the rules, though I do have an issue of production not declaring it against the rules. But again, it is really funny that they do all this and isolating the girly pops, all for it to turn out that's not even an advantage in here, and instead it's just the invitation to the fatal feast, which makes all this really lead to nothing. But again, it ends up being great TV here. Again, I think that is obviously the counterpoint to production not allowing Hope to block the door, as that obviously makes it less interesting TV, as I did feel like this was a fantastic segment for the show here, especially with Shania and Claudia being upset at the others and fighting with them immediately afterwards. But beyond this, we do end up seeing the Shady Bunch do some pretty impressive play here in them obviously clearly recognizing that there is a chance that the Fatal Feast ends up being a safety chain, as we had just seen it in the previous season, and end up plotting out what they're going to do in case of that situation, to which essentially the safety chain plays out exactly as they wanted it to where people do say that Kuzi was robbed of her HOH. However, again, I really don't feel like that's the case, because Kuzi got literally exactly what she wanted. Now, at the end of the day, I do think through her not having a formal HOH, she was stripped of the potential of gaining more leverage with the girly pops. And also, I think just in general, I don't like the fact that production didn't tell them up front that this wasn't going to be a normal HOH. And all it essentially was going to be was first pick in the safety chain. But to people that think that Kuzi's game was legitimately harmed because of the fact that this wasn't a normal HOH, I completely disagree, because I think, again, Kuzi got exactly what she wanted. The problem is that what she wanted was really bad. And again, quite possibly the worst decision that she could have made here, where again, they completely plot out what they want to do here, picking Hope first as a way to force him to not save Santina, which again, I think is even worse for Kuzi's game in the sense that obviously exposes her relationship with Hope in this situation, while also it allows Daniel, who ends up being the last person in the alliance to get the pick, to have all the leverage and being able to take the credit for saving the girly pops, as he obviously ended up proceeding to save them. So for Kuzi in particular, I feel like this is a pretty suboptimal plan as well, where again, this entire plan is based around them trying to stop Hope from saving Santina, something that she should have been wanting to happen. But either way, we do get to the eventual Fatal Feast, which, guess what? It's a safety chain. Who would have guessed? And this ends up playing exactly like how it played out on the previous season, just obviously last time it was actually done in a formal double eviction, while here it was done in the middle of the week, to which I'm kind of fine with how they structured this. Though, an aspect of the format that they kept here that I did feel was largely unnecessary, and I do think was an overall harm to it, was the fact that no one was able to talk in between choices, something that I get the initial premise of, and I do think it works very effectively when you don't know that this is coming. Again, in season 10, I feel like it worked out very well because they didn't know it was coming, and through that they had to make these impromptu picks that could expose their relationships. However, here, we literally see the Shady Bunch pre-game this, which completely ruins the entire point of not allowing them to talk. So I think at that point, you should allow them to talk, which could open up a lot of drama, especially with some of the matchups we see later on, with Santina being able to beg for her life when Hope had the choice, and also Shania having the pick between Claudia and Renee would have had more gravitas. But instead, it's obviously all done pretty quickly here, where again, it plays out exactly like Kuzi wanted it to. All of the crown are saved initially, and Daniel then goes on to save Shania and Claudia, with Renee, Ty, and Santina on the bottom, to which they end up competing in a safety comp, which ends up being a pretty boring comp of putting these candles in place on a chandelier, but Ty wins it. Obviously Kuzi's initial target, but through that it leaves Santina and Renee on the block, which is exactly what would have happened had Ty just won a veto. So again, it plays out exactly how it would have anyway, where Santina does get it voted out in a unanimous vote here, though they do give them 30 minutes to campaign, during which, again, not that much really happens here. But again, everyone votes out Santina, which I should also say, I didn't love the fact that they didn't allow Kuzi to vote here. I mean, in the last safety chain that we saw. Moose, who had won the equivalent of the HOH, was able to vote there. I mean, here it seemed to be stripping away the HOH of too much power in my opinion here, but to be honest, it wouldn't have mattered anyway. But obviously with that, with Lou Santina, who was obviously a massive character on this season, one that obviously won 2 HOHs along the way, caused a lot of drama, having this conflict with a lot of the house. She did definitely bring a lot to the TV show. However, I've seen a lot of people online talk about Santina as if she's a good player, and I genuinely do not know what these people are seeing. To me, Santina is a really terrible player of Big Brother, to where while she seemed competent in comps, almost every single move I feel like she makes in the game has been one that is not good for her game. I mean, she takes out JM in week 1, and while again I do think there is merit to it, I do think the fact that she makes a deal with JM to begin with and then takes him out just causes her to be mistrusted in the game, to where that is part of the reason why Kuzi wants to get rid of her during this HOH week. She's on the block in week 3 and would have gone home had Hope not won the veto, and even after he did, even after Zach causes this massive cheating scandal, even despite that, Zach comes extremely close to staying over Santina. Her invisible HOH was a massive wasted opportunity, one where she had the power there to build a new power structure, instead was left out of the power structure that formed during that week, and ends up just further turning Ty, one of her only allies left in the game, against her. And then she gets saved during Ty's HOH week by Canada, where had it not been for that, she would have been an easy boot there. And in this position where she goes home, she's in a position where she's being taken out by probably the only person in the game that fully benefits from her staying in the game. Like, to me, I feel like there is nothing good about Santina's game. Or again, I feel like there's never a point where Santina's actually making a move for her own best interests. But again, that is part of what makes her great TV, but again, I cannot wrap my head around people that actually legitimately think she's a good player. But with that, still in week 6, we do move on to the next round of gameplay, with the HOH taking place immediately after Santina's eviction, with it being a pretty strange comp here, one that was pretty broken, with it being Pick Your Poison, which was essentially a comp that we had seen in the Mole Netflix, which is weird they brought it over here, but essentially you had to drink these potions, with everyone have the guess who drank the poison, and if anyone guessed correctly, the person who drank the poison would be eliminated. And this is just such an easy game to game. I mean, we literally see Claudia game it almost right away, but it's literally a game where a majority will just easily control this if they know what they're doing. I mean, if you're a majority, all you have to do is split all of the majority votes on people that you don't want to win, and through that, those people will just not win, because more than likely at some point they'll end up getting the poison, to which they'll just be auto-eliminated because you put their votes on them. So again, there's no incentive for getting it right here, or no punishment for getting it wrong, so through that, it just really incentivizes this majority alliance to completely game the comp, while also being a comp that is largely based around luck. Again, obviously you end up picking the vials randomly, and through that you could just randomly just never get the poison, and through that being in a pretty good spot to win through that means as well. And overall, this is a pretty broken comp, but one that we do see play out pretty well, largely considering the fact that we don't have this very blatant majority alliance that's holding all the numbers here. And we do see Claudia pick up on the ideal strategy here, continuously voting for Ty initially until he's out. It does come down to Claudia versus Shania in a tiebreaker question, where Claudia ends up winning here, which for the umpteenth time this season, an HOH that makes a move that's not fully in their best interest. Also, like a lot of HOHs, has it kind of work out for him anyway, where right away we see Claudia talking about targeting Ty. And to be honest, this is a move that isn't entirely bad. I think targeting Ty for Claudia here is a move that does gain her a lot of respect from the jury. I think when people see that she targets Ty, I think that makes a lot of the jury think that, oh, she's here to play the game, and through that we'll give her a lot of credit for targeting Ty. Well, also, again, Ty is a pretty volatile player, to where you never really know where he's thinking, but at the same time, Ty is not the ideal target for Claudia here. And also, the ideal target is not even Kuzi, who I think most people would assume would be her ideal target. To me, her ideal target is Hope, the person that she ends up actually getting out by the end of the week, but again, seemingly purely by accident. As again, Hope is a player that is fiercely loyal to the Shady Bunch, while also being a player that is very catered towards the endgame comps, being extremely physical, but also being one of the best at studying, and through that could beat the girly pops that way, but also even beyond that, taking him out does weaken the Shady Bunch, to where it really leaves Kuzi with very little room to maneuver in the long term. And I do feel like as a whole, getting rid of Hope is the ideal plan for her. However, she just doesn't do it initially. where again she does plan on targeting Ty, during which we do see Ty actually get some decent content this week. And I will say, just in general, Ty does actually play kind of well here, where we do get a lot of content around him being a lone soldier, but we do see him give a pretty good pitch to Claudia. One is fully accurate there, telling Claudia that he's essentially in the middle of these two groupings, and that if the girly pops end up taking him out, then they'll just give numbers to the crown immediately afterwards, which again is definitely an accurate read on the house, which bravo to him, I guess. And beyond that, we also get to Wendy's, where, I will say Topaz ends up being at Wendy's this week, which was just entirely random. But at Wendy's, we do see Claudia taking Shania, and Shania also gives Claudia the logical strat here, telling her that it's kind of a waste to get rid of Ty, as he could potentially be a number for them. Well, again, targeting the likes of Hope is probably a more optimal move, though she seems to reject that as well, to where we do get to nominations, where she does still end up nominating Hope, but again, not for the intentions of actually targeting him, but more so defensively, as wanting one less person voting that could potentially keep Ty in the game. But probably more importantly is the fact that Hope is looked at as the next best competitor in the game, to where they're thinking that Hope could face off against Ty and potentially beat him in a veto, which again just kind of feels like her accidentally stumbling upon her actual ideal scenario here. But following this, we do get to the veto pick, which does end up leading to some drama here, with Claudia getting house guest choice, and instead of picking Kuzi or Daniel, with Kuzi in particular being someone that you would think would be better in competition, she ends up going with Renee, to which Kuzi is just incensed at this choice, talking about how stupid it is that she picked Renee, someone that's not going to win a competition, over Kuzi, who could beat Ty, which, straight up, I don't think Kuzi would have beaten Ty in this competition, considering it was a pretty physical one. But even beyond that, obviously this is just Claudia telling Kuzi that she doesn't trust her in a position where she could potentially be in danger if the veto is used. And all this could do is just further alert Claudia to the fact that she should be targeting Kuzi. So again, I felt like that was all bad on Kuzi's end, though I will say I did find it really funny how Claudia's picking of Renee was something that was even mocked in the previously on of the following episode, with it feeling like even the producers were not happy with this choice for whatever reason, probably wanting Claudia to be the one to get rid of Ty and being upset that didn't happen. But either way, we get to the veto comp, again a pretty physical one here, one that Hope comes extremely close to winning, though Ty ends up winning instead, which leads to this further downfall of the crown, where again, despite them being in this very strong position just a couple weeks ago during Santina's HOH, they have since then gotten extremely unlucky with comp results and certain twists, but they've lost an integral number for them in John, got rid of another one of their own numbers in Santina, while now we're in a position where the replacement nom is almost guaranteed to be another crown member, in turn essentially guaranteeing another crown member going home. But pretty much instantly, we do see Claudia decide on Kuzi as the replacement nom here, something that we do see Daniel campaigning to eventually change these nominations, though it never feels like the girly pops ever wavered on this, as to be fair, they probably shouldn't, as at least that opens up the potential of taking out Kuzi, though at the same time it does alert Kuzi the fact that she's in danger, which is probably not ideal either. But really none of this really mattered, as Hope was always going to go home anyway. The girly pops always looked at Hope as a bigger physical threat. Well, obviously Daniel and Nico were not in the position where they wanted to cut Kuzi right away, but even beyond that, I do think there are some other benefits to keeping Kuzi around for the girly pops that, to be fair, I don't think this was fully intentional on their end. I think they more so voted out Hope solely because of his physicality and his connections to Ty, but also I think there's the added benefit of keeping Kuzi around as someone to rally against later on, as if you keep Kuzi in the game, someone that everyone is aware that she will eventually win the game if she gets to the end, it does put you in a position where you should be given a bye in a future week due to the fact that everyone has this recognition that they need to go for Kuzi at some point. So I do think it was beneficial to keep Kuzi in the game over even Hope and Ty, which seems counterproductive at first considering how big of a threat she is, but that's kind of also why you need her in the game as a threat to be a shield for you. But through this week, we do end up seeing a lot of setup to the eventual endgame, with Daniel and Anika in particular being positioned extremely well through all this, where we do see Daniel and Anika end up creating a final four deal with Claudia and Shania, with Daniel using him having saved the girly pops during the safety chain to great effect here, while also that ends up being used as leverage to keep himself off the block as well, and ends up being the excuse for that. Which I should mention, the entire situation over Kuzi being the replacement nom is just kind of of weird here as well, in the fact that initially the plan was for Daniel to campaign to put Anika on the block instead of Kuzi. However, Kuzi instead decides to volunteer, which is kind of ridiculous, as again, there was potential for the girly pops to flip on her, but Kuzi ends up wanting to be on the block in this position, as she doesn't want to be one of the people that votes Hope out, and also wants to create a reason to come after Claudia for moving forward, where, like, why do you need a reason? You could just go after Claudia. But we do see, like, Kuzi getting upset at Claudia when she's told that she's going to be put on the block, despite the fact that, again, she wanted to be on the block. And while part of this is her playing it up to an excuse for her to go for Claudia, it also is, again, just poor play when you're on the block and Claudia's alliance holds the numbers. So all this was pretty ridiculous to me. And also it felt like she was just extremely insulted at the fact that they weren't giving her credit for how the safety chain played out, and instead gave that credit to Daniel. And also she ends up talking about how she's gonna guilt trip the girls into trying to keep her, which again, that strategy never works either. I just feel like all this was really terrible play from Kuzi. I think she's extremely fortunate that this doesn't backfire on her. But either way, also here we do see another Final Four form during this week, where we do see Kuzi campaigning to Tai, where Tai ends up offering her a Final 2 deal, to which Kuzi essentially turns it down and instead says, no, we're doing a Final 4 deal with Daniel and Anika instead, which again was also kind of poor play from Kuzi, and not just securing Tai as a Final 2 ally, probably the only person in the game at this point that would even be willing to take her to Final 2, but again, putting Daniel and Anika in a very strong spot here, having 2 Final 4 deals, while also the only person that they don't have a Final 4 deal with in Renee being someone that wants to take them to Final 5. So again, they are in a very strong spot at this point, especially with Daniel's assumed win equity based on exit interviews. Again, it was just a very impressive spot for him to be in, even though his actual direct path to the Final 2 was still a little bit rocky, largely due to questionable compatibility. But either way, we get to the actual eviction, where Hope does go home here. Mind you, Tai does end up voting out Kuzi, which is a vote that kind of comes out of nowhere. Hope ends up having a fun exit here, having prepared this dance that the cast does on their way out. And really just in general, I really liked Hope on this season. While he was a frustrating player to watch, largely because at points he wanted to quit the game, and beyond that, he also was just so willing to throw himself on the block, and he was just such a loyal number, one that was so willing to put himself in danger for his allies. I still found him to be a very likable presence on this season, one that just had a fun energy to him, at least at the points where he wasn't talking about quitting, and his exit here ends up being a major example of that. I mean, I feel like Hope, like Jonathan, just came off as very likable across this season, feeling like they just wanted to find a group that would remain loyal to them, and really the downfall of the Crown here makes his overall story even more tragic, but still ends up being a really fun character across the season. Obviously one that is involved in a cheating scandal that ends up being one of the major highlights of the season. And while being a bad player for most of the season, again, did have a decent week gameplay wise during his final week, at least, where he was kind of on the right path. He just couldn't get people to actually agree with him. But anyway, I did enjoy Hope's run on this season. Now for week 7, a week that starts off with surprisingly another HOH on the Eviction episode, one that does have Renee winning HOH, to which she instantly starts cursing and squealing, and this was a really fun reaction there, especially the fact that the announcer just mocked her earlier in the episode over her compatibility. But with Renee in power here, it does lead to another similar week, on the offset at least, of Tai being the big target that most people seem to want out. However, obviously there's a lot of debate here over who's going to go up next to Tai, which a lot of this scrambling over who goes up here really seems to be the final straw for the Shady Bunch here, and fully forming this crack between them that really was just kind of sad to see, considering how strong of an alliance they had been up to this point, with this obviously being another really terrible HOH result for them. But despite the initial instinct being that Cozy would be the one to go against Tai, being the two biggest threats in the game, Renee does actually instantly tell Kuzi that she isn't going on the block, leaving Kuzi seemingly really confident in the fact that she's safe for the entire week, despite the fact that Renee makes it very clear in this conversation that this doesn't mean that she isn't going to be the back door. But through that, it does leave Daniel or Anika as the two possible nominees, with Anika being instantly annoyed at this and is now willing to throw Kuzi under the bus, talking about how she is the biggest threat in the game, and also giving us a flashback, us showing Anika and Kuzi get into an argument over Anika not telling Kuzi who told her that Kuzi was a threat. And this was just a weird argument. I really didn't fully understand what was going on here. But again, it does seem to cause this fracture between the two. But even beyond that, we get a lot of content this week over Daniel and Nika being annoyed how Kuzi's openly campaigning in front of them, against them. And really the edit does feel like it turns a bit on Kuzi here, seeming to dunk her, which did lead to a bit of a mixed reception for Kuzi across this week, where it really felt like Kuzi was this universally loved character for most of the season, but I feel like in her downfall week here, it did feel like there was this increased negativity towards her. But again, all this really leads up to this really strange dynamic between Kuzi and Daniel and Anika, with Anika thinking that Kuzi has betrayed her and continuously talks about how Kuzi is lying to her across the week. We get this really awkward conversation when Kuzi walks in on Daniel and Anika, to which they obviously just stop talking, where really for me, this entire thing felt like Anika fully buying in to this narrative around Kuzi here, this one that was kind of made so they would feel better in taking out Kuzi in this situation, which I do think is a major difference between her and Daniel here, where again, Anika seems to fully buy into it, while Daniel seems to fully recognize that it's a game move here, and seems to be fully throwing Kuzi under a bus, knowing that it's better for his game, over him personally feeling betrayed by her like Anika is. But it's also during these scenes that we do get a lot of content from Shania this week, which was really random, of Shania seeming to get a lot of the credit on the show for the eventual Kuzi boot, with her keeping the other girly pops in line with this thought, and also getting content talking about turning Daniel and Anika against Kuzi. And it's really strange that Shania gets this content in the week that she eventually goes home, in a position where she hadn't really been that prominent in the show up to this point. But following this, we do have Daniel campaigning to Renee and doing really effective work here, where again, Daniel was in a very solid position coming into this week, having deals with literally everybody but Renee. But through this week, he's able to make a final 2 with Renee as well, which ends up keeping him off the block for the rest of the week. Again, really impressive work for Daniel, even though Daniel's game starts to unravel a bit towards the end of this week, which all this leads up to Ty and Anika being on the block, with Renee finally saying that she's nominating Anika because they've bonded over being underestimated players, which is if that's the case, then why'd you put her on the block? Either way, here we do finally see the Claudia, Shania, Anika, Daniel alliance on the show, which is funny that this is the point they decided to show it, considering it actually was pretty much crumbled by this point, with Daniel not even being loyal to his alliance, instead actually wanting to keep Ty in this position, recognizing that he could pick up Ty as a number and potentially have Ty take him to the end, over sticking with Claudia and Shania, who would eventually come after him and obviously be in a very strong position had they gotten to that proposed Final Four. However, it is also here where we do see Kuzi also wanting to keep Ty around, making it this kind of weird situation where of the eventual veto players, 3 of the 5 players there would use the veto on Ty, despite the fact that Ty was supposedly this big threat that everyone wanted out. However, Kuzi does have some decent strategic instincts in this moment, and essentially doing that strategy I just outlined with Daniel, but with her instead, which would be a very strong spot for her, as obviously she would win at the end against Ty, and Ty's probably the only person that would be willing to take her to the end. Now, the problem of all this is what we later see in the veto competition, where we do get to the veto comp, which ends up being one where you look through rooms for puzzle pieces, though along the way you have temptations like a free outfit from winners and puppies that are just there for you to look at, which those were lame. However, there was also a $1,000 prize, which was also really lame, but we'll talk about that. But probably the most notable one here is a loved one's visit, which is probably the one that had the most impact on how this comp played out, where we do see some of the loved ones not really get the memo here that this is a veto competition and end up wasting a lot of time with their loved ones. Again, along the way, we do see Kuzi taking the temptation here of $1,000, which is really insane. I mean, the fact that Kuzi talked previously about how she wanted to win the veto to use on Ty, she knew she was probably the backup target, and the fact that she decides to risk the veto here over $1,000 is, again, kind of insane, especially in her position where she's a absolute lock to win if she makes her way to the end. And while the time that she wasted on this specific temptation wasn't enough for her to end up winning the veto, she would have been extremely close to that point, to where if she also cut down the time she spent for her loved one, again, she could have won this veto here. That obviously plays a major factor into why she doesn't. All while Ty ends up completely ignoring his mom, which was kind of humorous, which allows him to eventually win the veto here in a position where Daniel had lost 10 seconds due to spending time with his his mom, and him only losing by 4 seconds, which was a pretty nice result for this comp, essentially meaning that these temptations actually mattered at the end. So I did kind of like seeing that. Though right away here, we do see Kuzi being happy that Tai won the veto, which it's like, why? That means you're going home. Though also we end up seeing this like shifting perception of Tai that was very strange, and how it feels like this is the turning point here of people starting to actually respect Tai, with Kuzi talking about how he deserves to be there and she wants to take him to the end because she wants to beat the best, which, I mean, that's bad. But again, it is strange how Tai's overall perception changed from being this cocky a-hole that everyone wanted out to now people seeming to respect him for his underdog story at this point. But really this week, we do see Tai and Kuzi working together pretty well in conducting this plan to pitch this Final Four deal to Renee, a Final Four deal with Claudia that actually seemed close to actually coming together, with Claudia seeming to actually consider it. And while it doesn't actually go through here, this seems to be a deal that, taking Kuzi out of it, later gets transitioned to a Final 3 deal that does seem to play a major factor into Claudia's decisions moving forward. But following this, we do see Tai using the veto, obviously, and Kuzi going up, leading to Tai telling Claudia and Renee that you miss all the shots that you do take. Also, Kuzi is openly upset at Renee, telling her to shut up and sit down. And this, again, felt like the major turning point for a lot of people with Kuzi, to where people were upset at how she treated Renee. Again, me personally, I really didn't think much of this. While I don't think I would personally react this way, and would hope that people would be able to look at this from a more rational point of view or a more emotional point of view. Again, I did feel like the overall hatred towards Kuzi for this was a bit rash, but I should also mention that this week did also contain a task, which we really haven't gotten that many of on this season, but this was a particularly notable one here of Renee having to do these random dares, which were pretty lame at first. Again, getting someone to do your laundry and having someone scratch your back, like those sucked. But the final one was convincing someone you have a crush on them, to which she ends up picking Daniel, to which he instantly laughs at how ridiculous this is. And again, this is all a really fun segment. Again, a great character moment here for Renee, who at this point becomes such a fun character in my eyes. It's just how much she kind of sucks at most things she does in the house. But again, also just the concept of her picking Daniel here is just ridiculous. Now, to be fair, there aren't that many options, especially from the men's side of things, where the only other person would be Tai, and that wouldn't be a good result. However, I think she could have just easily picked one of the girly pops, and this would have probably worked out fine. Though the fact that she picks Daniel ends up being a humorous result. But through this, she ends up failing the mission, being, I believe, the first time ever in BB Can that someone has failed the mission. However, they still give them the reward anyway, which is 5,000 Wendy's points, which who cares? But either way, finally we get towards the eviction, where right before it, we do see a scene from moments before the live eviction, one that does have Daniel and Kuzi having their final conversation, which is a really bad one for Daniel, where this ends up being a really strange week for the Daniel-Kuzi relationship in particular, where for most of this week, Kuzi was very upset at Anika, but not Daniel. She even told Daniel at one point that she'd be campaigning for him on the jury. However, out of nowhere, she all of a sudden starts to have these more bitter feelings towards him. We didn't even get to properly see on the show or even on the dailies of why this happened, where they end up getting into a fight in their last moments here, where Kuzi tells him that he has no backbone, that he isn't the player that she thought he was. And we have Daniel fighting back here, which is all pretty poor jury management here, especially in the fact that Kuzi was obviously going to be a very influential juror. So it's definitely started to be a knock on his winning chances here. And I will say, despite the fact that I didn't find much of what Kuzi did up to this point that egregious, I will say I did not love how Kuzi handled her exit here, particularly in how she talked about her upcoming jury vote, where it really just came off extremely self-centered to me, where it felt like Kuzi really just looked at the game entirely through her own lens, not being able to recognize how other people looked at the game, and really only caring about people making moves that benefited her, being upset at Shania still for using the veto on Renee because it didn't work into her plans, and being upset at Daniel for not saving her despite the fact that she knows she would have beaten him at the end, while also really propping up Tai because Tai is the only person that actually tried to keep her this week, despite the fact that they had a very rocky relationship across most of the season. Like, it felt like a lot of Kuzi's overall jury philosophy here really came down to who helped her the most, and she was going to make sure that that person won. Talking about campaigning for that person on the jury. Yeah, I really just did not love how self-centered Kuzi's overall game view ended up being here, but either way, obviously we get to the actual eviction, where it is a 3-1 vote, with Tai being the only vote for Kuzi. And Kuzi is obviously a major character on this season, obviously being one of the bigger players on this season. being the one in charge of flipping the power structure to take out Zach, and following that up with being the leader of the Crown Alliance, which had the numbers for a little while. But despite that, Kuzi ends up coming out of this being an extremely mixed player to me. Now, I do think from a social standpoint, she is incredible. I do think her overall social ability is really insane. Again, she had 3 people in Hope, Santina, and Jonathan all actively wanting to take her to Final 2 in positions where they knew that they were going to lose to her. How the problem of all this is the fact that Kuzi's strategic ability is very questionable, where I just disagree with most major decisions that Kuzi ends up making across this season. Where again, her targetings of Zach and Santina were all really bad moves. Her decision to not go all in and playing for this veto was a bad move. Her decisions to keep the girly pops around for as long as she did was a bad move. I do feel like strategically, I just disagree with so many of her decisions across this season that do make her more of a mixed bag for me. Now, at the end of the day, she would have won handily if she got to the end, and that is impressive. But again, there was no path for her to the end at this point in the game. And while some of that is due to poor comp results, some of that is also due to her own doing, particularly the Santina boot. But beyond that, again, she is still an incredible character. Probably the character that's going to stick out the most from this season in the long term. Probably the biggest shoe-in for a return from this cast. I do feel like Kuzi obviously played a major factor into making up a lot of what made this season as interesting as it was, even though a lot of that did also stem from her messy gameplay. But with that, this week's not over yet, as we do have the double eviction, which probably played out in the most insane way that it possibly could have. But we do start off with an HOH that involves information that they studied the previous night. That information being a crime scene that involved some former players returning, in Betty, Moose, Sarah, and Adam, which was a random assortment of players there. But again, cool to see former players back in that light. But this ends up being a true or false comp, where right away Daniel and Anika are in the lead, making it seem like one of them are finally going to win an HOH, only for Claudia to come out at the very end to win the comp. And through that, my first instinct is that Claudia's won. Shania is probably the safest person on the board. And boy, was I mistaken. But first we do see the noms right away. The noms being Anika and Daniel, which on paper, it kind of makes sense. Obviously, Claudia had just repaired her relationship with Ty, has this new Final 3 deal. So through that, nominating Anika and Daniel, obviously the only people that aren't in that Final 3 deal, but also not her closest ally in Shania, obviously makes sense. However, the problem here is obviously the Ty factor, in the fact that if Ty wins veto, he has every incentive to mess up Claudia's plans here and get her to nominate one of her own girly pops. And what do you know? Ty wins veto, and one that he really just blows away here, largely due to it being a somewhat physical comp of running back and forth. But again, even when he wins veto here, I'm thinking, okay, Claudia's just going to put up Renee. Renee's going home. But then we get this conversation between Claudia and Ty, where he says he's going to use it and tells her, why is she protecting Shania? Which, again, to me, right away, I'm thinking, this is ridiculous. There's no way Claudia is going to put up Shania, her number one ally from the very beginning of the game, until she eventually says, okay, which I genuinely couldn't believe that this is what we were seeing, is that Claudia does end up putting up Shania, her number one ally from the beginning of the game, someone that is undoubtedly going to take her to the end, and someone that she would undoubtedly beat at the end, probably the only person that she would be guaranteed to beat, and she takes her out in this situation in what is an extremely unforced error here. All you had to do is put Ty on the block. If you put Ty on the block, he has to use the veto on himself. You have Daniel and Nika on the block. Afterwards, you could do whatever you want there. However, again, this obviously puts Ty in this power position that allows him to make this power move, getting rid of Shania, brings Claudia closer to him, puts him in the middle of the game at this point, with Daniel and Anika and Renee and Claudia essentially being these two duos, also keeping in Anika, someone that is probably the easiest person for him to beat in most given challenges. Again, this really just felt like this massive flip in the game here of Ty actually now becoming the front runner to win the game, with his jury chances being on the up with Kuzi loving him, and now him being so close to the end game with a lot of comp ability, while also him having this power move to claim and him being the reason why Shania goes out. It is insane what ends up happening here, and all this just felt like such a missed opportunity for Claudia, getting rid of her closest ally in a position where had she just put Ty on the block, the girly pops would have been 3 of the final 5, essentially in a position where all they need to do is get rid of Ty at some point, and one of the girly pops is almost guaranteed to win the game. Yet she throws away that position because she's not willing to put Ty on the block. which felt so ridiculous here. And I mean, it is kind of humorous, the fact that Claudia is sobbing over she can't believe she's in this position and she doesn't know how to decide. And it's like, again, this is entirely on you. But again, we see Shania go on the block and Shania get evicted in a 2-1 vote, which is just an insane outcome for this double. Shania being probably one of the safest people in my mind coming into this double, and for her to go out in this position was really insane to me. However, I will also say a lot of people obviously praise Ty for what ended up happening here, and obviously Ty does make a move here in forcing Shania out the door. However, I really don't give him that much credit for this. I don't think he manipulated Claudia into keeping him off the block. I think it was the fact that I was already winning so many competitions that made her just assume, well, I might as well get on his good side if he's going to continue to win competitions that kept him off the block. And really, I feel like that's a lot of what ends up happening with Ty's game. In this end game here is that a lot of people just assume that Ty is going to win. And while obviously they have the incorrect reaction to that and trying to work with him and keep him off the block in order to gain favor with him instead of putting him on the block to guarantee that he doesn't mess up your plans, I do feel like that still plays a major factor into the overall strategy of this end game and how people just seem kind of resolute in the fact that Ty was just going to win comps anyway. But even then, I do also kind of question his overall decision making in taking out Shania herself, as while Shania is the person that he has less of a connection to and also has more of a connection to Claudia, Shania is also the weakest competitor on the board while also being the biggest jury goat on the board. And by taking her out here, he really gets rid of someone that he would have easily beat at the end, while also being someone that he could beat in competitions towards the end, unlike Renee, who had shown to be decent in mental competitions. So I do think there's even a question mark in that light. But also, really, at the end of the day, I don't think he's thinking about this from a game standpoint. And this is also another bothersome aspect of Ty's game to me, is that it just feels like so much of his game is ego driven. It feels like his decision to take out Shania here was more so propelled by the fact that he was upset at the fact that Shania wouldn't listen to him during the week that she used the veto on him. Using that as one of his justifications for getting rid of her to Claudia, again, just feeling like him having this bruised ego over how dare Shania not listen to me, over him doing this for any true game reason. But anyway, here we obviously do end up losing Shania, who was my winner pick of the season, and it didn't turn out exactly like I thought it would. Again, I did feel like Shania seemed to have a lot more gusto in the preseason and seemed to be very good socially and seemed to know the game a bit. And to be fair, I do feel like Shania is probably the most grounded strategic thinker of her, Renee, and Claudia. I mean, she did have some misguided notions in the fact that she thought Renee was the shoe-in to win at the end, which she was not. But I mean, again, she had some good strategic thoughts at points, certainly more than Claudia. However, I do feel like she was just not active enough. Obviously, she spent the first half of the game kind of more preoccupied with her relationships with Rob and Dan and the girly pops, so where she didn't really expand beyond that. And through that, I think that very much neutered her overall social ability, to where, again, I think she is good socially, it's just that she didn't expand beyond her initial group, which I do think that led to her not having much respect from the jury. Where at this point, she was probably the least likely person to win the game, and as she got to the end, to where even her move in saving Renee was looked at as a bad move for most of the people in the house, despite the fact that it clearly wasn't. So I think Shania definitely struggled on that end. And really, as a character, I mean, there isn't much to say about her. She was just kind of there. And she did get to arguments at points, particularly at points where she felt the girly pops were mistreated. She did seem to be a loyal friend, so at least there's that, but really not the most dynamic personality, and one that did kind of underwhelm me as a player, even though there was some good stuff here and there. But now for week 8, the final 5 round, which was just a bizarre week, one that really just emphasized a lot of the issues with the current baby can formula. But before we get to that, we thankfully get half of an episode dedicated to recapping the double eviction, which was mostly mundane. And again, coming out of the double eviction, when seeing the events there, I think you come out of it being impressed that Ty was able to convince Claudia to take out Shania, only for us to then see in this recap here that he didn't. That Claudia came up with this herself, and Ty just stood there with her telling him this plan with him not even looking at her in the eye, which should have been a clear indicator that he was not going to go through with not using the veto. Which again is humorous when people talk about how great of a manipulator Ty is, when anyone that knows anything about reading body language could clearly tell that he was not on board with not using the veto. Either way, again, it wastes like about half of the first episode of this week, which takes us to the HOH, which ends up being a similar comp to what we've seen on Survivor, of balancing this like idol on the end of a beam, and this comp goes for literally 17 seconds, which was just so funny. Like, I did find it funny that the entire segment of them showing this competition was exponentially longer than the actual competition itself, where literally Daniel, Ty, and Renee all fall in a row here, leading to Anika winning her first ever HOH in a 17-second endurance comp. But really the rest of that Tuesday night episode was relatively slow. We did get Adele being there at Wendy's, which was random, and him doing the crown symbol, which I did feel like was some outside information there, essentially telling her that the crown symbol is popular, which again doesn't really affect anything, but again, they should have probably not done that, though there's probably a more egregious example of outside interference later in the week. But anyway, we do end up seeing Daniel and Anika talk about the plan, to which Anika decides that she's going to be targeting Claudia, which, I mean, to be fair, is a better target than Renee in this position, but I do think at this point where Ty is winning all these competitions, it is obviously the ideal strat to get him out. Though at the same time, again, we're gotten to the point where it felt like people were just kind of resigned to the fact that Ty was going to win these competitions, and through that not even try to get him out. That playing in the factor into why Anika ends up nominating Claudia and Renee here, leaving Ty off the block. Really, this makes no sense. I mean, again, like, yes, you're not going to target Ty. However, again, it's just like what just happened, where Ty is obviously going to be in this position where he can win the veto and force your hand into doing something that you don't want to do. And it's funny because, like, Anika even gets this content talking about how Cece is so clueless for letting Shania go home like that when she literally almost does the exact same thing. It's like, and obviously this was extremely frustrating to watch. But really, a lot of the content of this week ends up being largely focused around Ty, where, again, it really felt like this was a point in the season where, because of how many comps Ty had won, he really ends up playing a major factor into how the house is structured, not really because he's doing anything well strategically, but just simply because his overall comp ability has placed him in this position. But again, we still see him playing terribly here, where we see him getting into an argument with Claudia and Renee immediately after the Shania boot, being extremely condescending to them, telling them that they're playing emotionally. And really, it felt like the edit was really dunking on him as well, which was a surprise, as coming into this week, the assumption was that Ty was going to be the biggest jury threat on the board because of how Kuzi went to the jury rooting for him, and BB Can especially likes to really hype up their winners. So see Ty get really dunked in the edit here was a bit of a surprise. But really, Ty's behavior across this week just started to remind me a lot of Jackson. And really, this season does have a lot of BB21 parallels throughout it, but this Ty and Jackson parallel was really just ended up feeling so on the nose here, with the way that Ty treats Claudia being very reminiscent of how Jackson treated Holly, with the way that Ty talks to people and the way that he manages the jury being very similar to that of how Jackson played in BB21, but really with even less game ability, as I feel like at least Jackson did do some things that weren't solely reliant on his comp wins, while I do feel like Ty's game is almost completely reliant on his comp wins. Anyway, this leads into the Power of Veto competition, where, what do you know, Ty wins the veto because it had a physical component, and any comp that has a physical component, Ty will win, which, again, at this point, it just became extremely frustrating to see Ty continuously win these competitions. Not because he's actually that great of a comp competitor, but more so because BB Can Production can't stop themselves from making comps that very much favor physical people. Like, why did this comp need this very physical aspect of going back and forth to memorize everything? I mean, we even see Ty take more trips here and even struggle at the puzzle, which really almost no one else does. Yet despite that, Ty still beats Daniel, who is in second place by 4 minutes. And this really just shows you how heavily favored these competitions are to these physical guys. It's essentially production handpicking the type of player that they want to do well in the game, and that's what I've always talked about with competition wins, is how luck dependent they are and how production really holds your fate in their hands with what competitions they decide to pick. And I do feel like the overall endgame format of Big Brother Canada is simply broken at this point with how many physical competitions there are, to where I feel like BB Can has done a pretty decent job in recent years in balancing out competitions, particularly in the early to middle portions of the game, but for some reason they just fail to fix the endgame format here, which again, when Ty is the only physical guy left on the board, it really just gives him a massive advantage simply because he's a physical guy. And really, it ends up dictating a lot of the strategy over the course of this week, where really the rest of this week here ends up being people sucking up to Ty and playing into his ego, despite the fact that Tai is actually playing this pretty poorly, or he is doing some really terrible jury management, burning relationships with Renee and Anika across this week, as we do see in this really weird series of events moving forward, where Renee does campaign to Anika, where she ends up mentioning that, do you really want to keep Tai and Claudia in the game? To which Tai ends up hearing about this and is incensed that she would campaign against him, and uses this as an excuse to get her out because that's Tai for you. Which again is kind of dumb when they're really the only other options to go on the block. Now, the one thing I think you can somewhat give him credit for this week is the fact that he does then go back to Claudia and ends up telling Claudia about this, to where he convinces Claudia that she's okay with getting rid of Renee, which, to be fair, it doesn't matter anyway. Like, no matter what, Renee would have gone home in this situation, considering Tai's vote was the only one that really mattered. And to be fair, that's kind of what we see play out anyway. But through this, they do end up solidifying their final two, with both of them seeming to be truthful to each other, which does put Tai in a pretty good spot in that position. But again, it feels like an unearned position. One that, again, wasn't earned because of his actual social strategy, but more so just due to the fact that he was winning comps and Claudia just gave up at this point in trying to get him out. But really, this was also just sad to see from Claudia, seeing her regress after, again, being this person that put up Tai, put up her own showmance and tried to get him out, and now is at the point where she's taking out her two closest allies back to back to be at the end with Tai. But this is followed by Tai then going to Anika and telling her that he's going to use the veto, to which she's obviously really pissed off about this, to which she says that he lied and he's so incensed at her saying that. Though at the same time, again, like, this is entirely on Anika though. Or again, like the Claudia situation last week, again, like, why didn't you just put up Tai? And it is super funny to once again see Anika being so upset at Tai for doing the exact same thing, literally asking him, why are you doing the same thing? And it's funny too, considering we see Tai literally use the exact same wording as he did with Claudia the previous week. So again, all that's really funny. But what's really weird about all this is the fact that, again, he is using the veto here to force Daniel on the block, only to then not vote Daniel out and instead vote out Renee. And through this move, obviously, he really pisses off Anika, which, to be fair, again, like, I think it is a move that is beneficial to him, obviously, in keeping Claudia in the game, someone that would be willing to take him to the end. But at the same time, it does very much piss off Anika, to where it completely severs that relationship. It also makes him have to cut Renee, in which I feel like he handles this completely wrong. And him getting into fights with Renee over what Renee said and blames everything on her. Again, very Jackson-like in that her suspicions and her anxiety are why she's going home. Again, being extremely condescending to her. Again, blaming it all on the fact that she mentioned Tai and Claudia's name to Anika earlier in the week, but also further getting upset at her for not trusting him, despite the fact that he's been trying to get her out for weeks at this point too, which was all really stupid. And again, really terrible jury management here. But again, it does all lead up to this fight between Renee and Anika over the wording of what Renee said, which again, all just felt like essentially a game of them trying to appease Tai's ego in this position. But either way, after Tai does use the veto here, there was never any doubt that the plan was going to change, though we do get an interesting segment before the vote, one where we do see that the players are now on slop and have no food for seemingly no reason, until we get the reveal that it's time for the Wendy's reward points to come into effect, where Spicy V enters the house to host an auction that they're using the reward points to buy things, which, I mean, I will say, fun idea, but it really plays out in pretty much the worst possible way, where it really plays out very representative of the entire season, where Tai comes into this with a massive unearned advantage, having almost double the next highest point getter, simply because Kuzi awarded him all of her points at the very end. And because he has so many points here, everyone else does even try to outbid him, which again is pretty much exactly what's happening. By the way, we get dumb rewards like $1,000 and $3,000. We get a tray full of Wendy's food. We get Claudia getting a video message, Nika getting a phone call. But again, the frustrating aspect of this is that Tai is just handed the game advantages here, where he does buy a 1-minute video plea to the jury, which, to be fair, is also kind of a dumb prize, as more than likely this prize is always going to go to the person that has the most points, and the person with the most points is usually going to be the one that is already liked by the jury, considering the jury is the one that pretty much gives people the points. So it felt kind of pointless. But also, he does win a strategy session with BB Can 9 Tai, which was weird that we got this meeting between Tai and Tai. But also, it's like, would I really want BB Can 9 Tai to be giving me jury advice, considering his terrible jury management and the fact that him winning the game was more so based around him winning final HOH and cutting Tara? So again, I did find it funny that of all people, they got Tai Ty from BB Can 9 to give people advice on jury management. But either way, we get to the eventual vote where we do get a 1-1 tie with Ty voting Renee and Claudia voting Daniel, though obviously it was more so for show here as Anika does obviously vote out Renee, during which we get to Arissa's exit interview, which I really did not like how Arissa was so open with information here, openly revealing that Ty didn't vote for her, which to be fair, she probably already knew, but again, I feel like it was incompetent production to just openly let this out, but also she pretty much also rats out Claudia in this, asking her if she's disappointed that Claudia didn't fight more to save her, which is essentially telling her that Claudia wanted her out, which I did feel like that was very questionable as well. But either way, again, we lose Renee, who I really loved as a character on this season. Like initially I did find her kind of annoying, however, the more and more time went on, I feel like she became very endearing, and her just being this interesting character, one that kept on saying bootay and talked about how she was pissed and had these fun reactions to things, was really over the top at points, but again, humorously so, but was also kind of just like a failure at most things, where she's obviously really bad at comps aside the one HOH she won. We really see her fumbling the ball in a lot of other random situations. Like I just found her to be overall a really fun character. Again, as a player, she's not great. I mean, there were points where it did feel like she had a decent strategic mind. It felt like she knew what she should do, but she was just so bad socially to where she couldn't really execute on most things, and really just like let her frustrations get a hold of her at points to where it kind of clouded her strategic thoughts as well, to where, again, like I don't think she's a great player, but I did have a lot of fun with her on the show here and did find her to be a pretty interesting character. And now for the final 4 round of the game, which was pretty predictable, though we do start off with a quiz HOH comp, which Ty wins, which really felt like near game over for the season at this point. That Ty, who has obviously dominated in physical comps, has now won a days quiz comp in a situation where he didn't even know his days at the beginning of the week, and actually had both Claudia and Daniel helping him out and studying days across the week, to the point where he actually wins the comp here over Claudia and Daniel, which is just ridiculous. But at this point, we do get the game being set up as a 2v2 with Ty and Claudia facing off against Daniel and Anika, with Daniel getting some pretty decent content in the episodes, being annoyed that Ty keeps on beating him, but talking about how he's cutting his ass when he needs to, and seeing a conversation between him and Claudia, both talking about how Ty would be tough to beat, which it felt like another one of these situations where BB Can typically wouldn't be this negative on Ty in the edit if they actually thought he was genuinely going to win, so that definitely did surprise me to see this here. But either way, follow this up with the Wendy's visit for the week, which has everyone getting invited to Wendy's, where they meet Rachel Riley, which was so random. I love it, like they completely break the trends that they were following to have Rachel Riley show up here, which I believe is the first BBUS contestant appearance in years. And it's funny too, considering Daniel's pretty much the only person that knows her. I believe Claudia does as well, but still almost no reaction to Rachel Riley. But anyway, we then follow that up with the obvious BB Can awards, which are themed as a prom for some reason. Again, like we're in a murder mystery themed house, yet they're doing prom. I did find it really funny that every single award that Ty was up for, he lost here. Even ones that didn't even make sense that he lost. Things like Shanea's celebration being better than his, or Dan and Anika's kiss during a party game winning over Ty and Claudia's supposed romantic kiss. So I did find all that funny. However, I will say that I also didn't love that they showed some private conversations during these, particularly the one of the crown consoling Hope, which I did feel like showing moments like this could have alerted the likes of Ty and Claudia to potential jury chances there. Though I don't really think it played that much of a factor, but Ty does end up nominating Claudia and Daniel here, fully recognizing that the nominations don't matter, so at least good on him for that. I'll also say decent play here in keeping Anika off the block. Anika, who is a pretty emotional player, and through that, if she had gone on block, I do think she would have taken that personally. But anyway, following this, we do get a jury segment, which I've been neglecting in this review, and I don't typically talk about them, though this one does technically have some minor game ramifications, where we do see Renee entering, which I should mention, really loved Kuzi in the jury segments here, to where, again, like, I don't love her overall jury approach. However, it is really funny to see her celebrating as the girly pops enter. But here we do get to see Ty's plea that he won in the auction, with his plea being pretty bad, where he essentially gives out his 5 criteria for what he thinks makes a winner, which is not a great look to the jury. I think to the jury it comes off as he's essentially telling them how to vote. So I did feel like this was another thing that Ty fumbled on this season. By the way, we then get to the veto comp, which was also pretty boring, it just being a standard escape room style challenge that Claudia ends up winning, beating Daniel by almost 20 minutes. But with Claudia winning the veto here, obviously Daniel and Anika are going to be split up here, though So this ends up being an interesting choice here, to where I think both have their pros and cons. With Daniel, he's someone that is probably more likely to win final HOH, as someone that could probably do better in days comps, and is also someone that is pretty likely to take her to the end, though is also potentially a bigger jury threat, while Anika is someone that is looked at as less of a jury threat, even though I don't even think that's necessarily the case. Or if it is, it's barely so, as I do think a decent amount of the jury did seem relatively pro Anika, but Anika is someone that is less likely to take Claudia to the end, but is also one that is less likely to win the final HOH. So I do think this is an interesting decision for Claudia, one that she did seem to struggle with, though Ty seemed to be very resolute in taking Daniel over Anika, which I do think is a misstep for him, where I don't think there's really any way that Daniel takes Ty to the end. While I feel like Anika could have potentially done so, especially after he had played vetoes on her, and also her not so great relationship with Claudia. And also, again, for Ty, Anika's just an easier person to beat in the last few comps. So I do think it was pretty misguided for him to be pro Daniel. And it does feel like that is essentially the deciding factor in Claudia's decision here, with her being pretty split before their conversation. So again, it just feels like Claudia does a move in her best interest unpurposely once again, while Ty is again going for something that's not in his best interest. But obviously, it all leads up to Anika getting voted out. Though, before we end the episode, we do get the reveal of the special sponsor they were waiting till the end of the season to announce. That sponsor giving us a sneak peek into the final HOH, which turns out to be The Little Mermaid, where we get a trailer of it, and that's the sneak peek, which is like, this is so weird. Where we literally just see the trailer and then cut the shots of the players looking really unamused outside of Daniel. He seems to be the only one playing into this. So again, I did find that really funny. But either way, we do lose Anika, who I feel like turned out to be a better player than I expected. Now, by the end of the season here, a lot of people were really frustrated with her, talking about how she's just a floater and a goat, which I don't even think is necessarily the case. I mean, yes, she was not the most strategically minded player in the world. However, I do think she's a player that was obviously involved with the Crown, this majority alliance that was there for a lot of the game. She stuck with Daniel and alongside him was in the best position for most of the game, while also having a very decent chance of winning the jury, where despite people not looking highly of Anika, the Crown and the jury were very pro Anika and did want her to win. Now again, how much of that was fully purposeful and how much of that was more so on Daniel and Kuzi than herself? I mean, probably a decent amount of it, but I still feel like she should get some credit for her positioning on the season. And we do see her at points make decent points to the likes of Daniel to get him back in the right mind state. So again, overall, I do think Anika is a bit understated as a player, even though still, again, some misguided strategic thoughts at points. But again, I guess a character, I think she's also pretty decent. I think she's willing to get in fights. We see her sticking up for herself, sticking up for her friends. And I do feel like that's also an interesting character trait of hers. So while, again, I think a lot of people will always look at her as this floater who was barely playing the game, I do find that notion to be somewhat misguided, and I did end up enjoying her role on this season. Now we're finally here at the finale, which was extremely underwhelming. Where again, coming into it, I was thinking maybe there's a chance that someone other than Ty could win, and that maybe someone would cut Ty, but nope. That doesn't happen. But anyway, we do start off with us getting a live audience for the first time in 2 years, which was a nice change of pace here, though that's followed up by a 15-minute recap, which, again, they do this every season, but still, it doesn't change the fact that it's just a waste of time. But anyway, we get to part 1 of the HOH, which ends up being a stacking comp, one where it really felt like it was anyone's game. Though I did feel like this was the major point in the episode where I felt like Daniel probably needed to win this if he was going to have a chance. However, we do see Claudia win it instead. And then we get to part 2, which is the more typical questions with a little bit of physicality. Though to be fair, I mean, this one was pretty balanced, with it probably being a bit more skill-oriented. But we do see Daniel getting really hung up on a specific question, which leads to Ty winning part 2. And at this point, the game is over. Where really it didn't matter who won the final HOH. I do think both Claudia and Ty would have taken each other. But we do see Claudia win this, which gave us, again, a little semblance of a chance of maybe she'll cut Ty, something she talked about doing way back, and take Daniel to the end, who, I mean, to be fair, probably would have beat her anyway. But we do see her instantly hugging Ty immediately after she won, in a way that made it pretty clear that she was going to take him to the end. So obviously Daniel does get voted out here, which, I mean, at the end of the day, was frustrating to see. I mean, again, it's frustrating to see Claudia still working with Ty, essentially choosing Ty over anyone else in the game, despite the fact that Ty really mistreated her across this season. But from a pure game perspective, to be honest, it probably didn't matter anyway. While her voting out Ty would have been this move that, again, she could have propped up as her finally cutting her showmance, I just think it was probably a bit too late. Now, again, I do think it probably would have been a closer vote, though. Even in that situation, situation. I just don't really feel like she would have ended up winning the game there. Or I do feel like Ty would have been upset at her for doing so. And then you already have a lot of anti-Claudia people, from the girly pops not being happy with her. Well, even Kuzi wasn't particularly happy with Claudia. Well, also Daniel had this pro-Crown sentiment from the likes of Jonathan, Hope, and Anika. And also even Dan was someone that was seemingly pro-Daniel. So again, like, I really don't think she would get the votes here. So from a pure game perspective, it doesn't really matter. But just from a pure entertainment standpoint, it was purely frustrating to see this happen. But with that, we do lose Daniel, who is a person that I do see a lot of negativity about online. A lot of people seeming to look at him as this floater that did nothing in the game. And I genuinely don't understand where this sentiment comes from. Like, I really don't understand the hatred that's out there for Daniel, because from my perspective, I feel like Daniel's probably the best player of the season. I think Daniel played a game that had him really in the middle of the house for most of the season. He really was never in danger until the tail end of the game, and a lot of that came from the fact that his side just never won a competition. And really, obviously, that's the biggest fault for Daniel, is the fact that he just didn't win a competition outside that singular veto he won earlier on, and obviously wasn't able to split up Ty and Claudia. But outside that, again, he had impeccable positioning for most of the game. Again, he was obviously within the crown and had their loyalty to where he would have had most of their jury votes pretty locked in, again, outside of Kuzi. Also, he was just a very likable person to where even the people from outside the crown just genuinely liked him. With there being so many people that came out of the house having Daniel as their number 2 person that they're most likely to vote for. Which obviously that eventually changes once Ty goes on his comp run. But again, there is definitely a lot of merit there to his overall win equity during the mid game. Also, those relationships kept him really safe from even the other side, the other people that weren't in the crown, where the girly pops all wanted to keep Daniel around. Ty took Daniel all the way to final 3. And there's people talking about how Daniel was just dragged because he was bad at comps, when that's simply not the case. He was taken to the end because he had these very strong social relationships. I think the final 4 is the epitome of that, where picking Daniel over Anika there is a clear indication that that is simply not the case, with Daniel performing better in the majority of comps than Anika. So again, I do feel like Daniel's game has been really demerited outside the house to a degree that I just don't understand. I don't know if it's because people just find him annoying. I don't know if it's because people are obviously pro Kuzi and they were upset at him not being loyal to Kuzi. But I do genuinely think that Daniel was the best player of the season. And to be honest, I don't even think it was that close. But with that, we're down to the final 2, where we did get a jury roundtable, one that was really fun, surprisingly, where I feel like a lot of the recent ones have been pretty ho-hum. However, right away, when Anika comes in, she just immediately starts arguing with Kuzi, which was really fun there. Now, again, the overall argument was kind of dumb, because, again, Anika was upset at Kuzi for betraying her, when, again, Anika was also planning on doing the same thing. However, I don't also love the fact that Kuzi was also saying that, oh, this is Big Brother and we can lie and everything, when she's upset at other people for lying to her. It's like, I felt like just everyone was hypocritical in this situation, but again, it was fun TV nonetheless. But again, at this point, I did feel like it was pretty clear Ty was winning here. I really didn't have any doubt, especially from the fact that the jury seemed to be very upset at Claudia. Though I do see Daniel coming out to where everyone seemed disappointed at the fact that he was coming out, along with there being shock at the fact that Claudia won the final HOH, which I think further sunk her chances there. But we get to the jury questioning, where I feel like both of them performed really terribly. Now, Claudia didn't get as many questions as Ty did, though even then, she really just ends up doubling down on the negatives of her game, really doubling down on the fact that she took Ty to the end, making it sound as if it's this big pro, when that's exactly the issue, is that he took Ty to the end. That's the problem, where this really ends up propping Ty up even more. The fact that Claudia cut her own closest allies to go to the end with Ty, which again, I just thought was overall a really bad look for her. But this is also while Ty was also terrible, where he gets asked by Jonathan if he thinks he played with integrity and humility of all things, and Ty says he did, saying that other people played a sneaky game, but he never lied. When literally his other main talking point about how great his game is that he ran the game from Final 6 on, which was because he lied to stay off the block. But again, he keeps on talking about how his social game was overlooked, only then talk about strategic aspects of his game, clearly because he had no social game, and the things that he claims to be his social game are things that came from the social capital he gained through winning competitions, not through his actual social ability. And we do once again have Ty doubling down on talking about how it's Renee's fault that he didn't work with her, which, I mean, he gets Renee's vote anyway, but again, this is all just so bad. And obviously, just again, the decision was probably already made by the time we came in here, but still, I felt like Ty definitely had one of the worst performances from a winner here. And again, you could just see how anti-Claudia the jury seemed to be, with Kuzi asking her question and not being receptive to it at all. And Nika asks her questions, just shaking her head the entire time. And you can clearly tell where the jury was going. Now, before we get to the winner reveal, we do get a pretty mundane reunion segment where the only thing notable there was Vanessa calling out Zach, with her saying that Hope was the most influential player in the game because she got Zach out. Also surprisingly, we get the fan favorite award before the vote reveal, where we do see Jonathan winning here, which was not a big shock. I mean, I know a lot of people were pro Kuzi, obviously. However, again, knowing the casual fan base, especially one that voted Marty in BBCan 10, again, the fact that Jonathan wins BBCan 11 is not that big of a surprise. But then we also get to the winner reveal, where it's almost unanimous tie win, obviously, where the only vote for Claudia ends up being Shania, with that vote itself being one that clearly felt like a sympathy vote. And again, just Ty's win here is extremely underwhelming to me. I do think Ty played a mostly mediocre game. While there are impressive aspects here and there, I feel like a lot of those came off the back of him winning competitions more so than anything he actually did socially. And I feel like most times he did things socially, he actively ruined the social capital that he gained through his physical competitions. I think he had terrible jury management. I think he made a lot of suboptimal strategic plays. But again, he won, which I think is a more damning offense on the current state of Big Brother Canada, more so in the fact of how much of an advantage the physical guys have in veto comps in particular, and through that allowed Ty to gain as much social capital as he did, despite the fact that he did almost everything else wrong. But I will say again, in comparison to Claudia, I fully understand the jury vote here. I do feel like even I probably would have voted for Ty in this situation, considering how Claudia herself played an extremely misguided game as well, one where she burns all of her relationships to take the guy that has the biggest underdog story to the end, and a guy that has continuously mistreated her across the game, that by her taking him to the end just makes her look weak, despite her assuming that it would make her look the opposite. So really, to me, it's like they both played bad games, both very much playing against their best interests at many points across the season, though I feel like Ty does outplay Claudia at a couple moments in the end game that probably give him my vote in this situation. But let's wrap up the review by talking about the final two, starting it off with Claudia, who, again, just was largely a disappointment on this season by the end of it. Again, the fact that she essentially lays down her entire game that she built up to the final six to take Ty to the end is just ridiculous in my mind. Again, the Girly Pops had 3 of the final 6 in a position where she probably does beat, for sure, Shania, and then maybe even Renee, and takes that position to take a person that she would lose to at the end, while also continuously making decisions that gave him more power. And again, it's just a frustrating game to watch. And I feel like Claudia's just a player that had so much potential, but then just wasted it at almost every single opportunity. I mean, she had this positioning early on that she could have easily played the middle, essentially do what Daniel ends up doing, but she continuously throws away that position. I just think Claudia is a terrible strategic player, though was one of the better comp competitors of the season. I would even debate her being a more well-rounded comp competitor than Ty, and she did have a pretty solid social game earlier on in the season, though again, still not as expansive as what it could have been. But I think there's a lot of potential there with Claudia, but she essentially just throws that potential all away through how bad she is strategically, to where she just became a very frustrating player to watch across the season. And despite her needing to win less competitions than Ty did, and probably being better positioned for more of the season than Ty, I still feel like the amount of missteps that she ends up making across the season and how overall flawed her endgame strategy seemed to be, I feel like I still would not have voted for her at the end here. Well, let's move on to Ty, the winner of the season, who, again, I've pretty much said my piece on him across this entire video. I do not like Ty. I don't think he's that good of a player. I don't think he's that likable of a person. I think Ty is a player that seemed to just benefit off the fact that all the broy guys got taken out early, to where he was the last broy guy standing, and in a season that had a whole bunch of comps that were catered to broy guys, he ended up benefiting off of that. I mean, despite his impressive veto run towards the end of the season, he then ends up losing most of the endgame comps, doing poorly in both the Final Four veto and HOH Part 2. And I do feel like if he were to play again, I would not have much faith in him to win out in the way that he did on this season. Socially, again, he was terrible. While I do think he started off well, to where in the first few weeks he was pretty well ingrained socially, he then blows up all those relationships through him just being a dick to people and continuously playing from a high horse, and never seen the backfire on him because the fact that he won so many competitions that people started to respect him for that. And then strategically, again, he is very bad as well. Again, he makes actively bad strategic decisions constantly. I mean, he takes out Rob in week 2, blowing up the entire game, despite the fact that Rob wanted to take Tai towards the end. He then was gung-ho on targeting Santina for a lot of the mid-game in a position where there was an entire Crown Alliance. That was the majority of the house at that point that was directly coming for him. He then fails multiple times in the end game to keep around the people that he wants to save until we get to the final 6, where again, at that point, it just felt like everyone else just kind of gave up due to the fact that they were resigned to the fact that Tai was just going to win out from that point forward, with Claudia essentially dropping her entire game for him, which again, I guess I'll give him some credit for, which is probably the reason why I would vote for him over Claudia, but it doesn't even feel like something that he truly earned. Just feeling like something that he was handed due to the fact that production crafted a lot of competitions that very much catered to his skill set. Again, I do think Tai is all around a pretty bad player. Probably one of the worst players to win the game of Big Brother. Essentially, in my eyes, being an even worse version of Jackson as a player. However, when assessing his game, I don't think he's necessarily at the bottom of my winner rankings, which, I mean, to be fair, BB Can has had a lot of pretty bad winners. To where he's at least above Jillian, who, for all intents and purposes, shouldn't have won to begin with. Probably above Sarah, who just like completely lucked her way into a win through so many twists benefiting her. And at that point, he's probably around the Pax Bros and Kevin Martin, kind of in that spot. I would probably say closer to the Pax Bros side of things than Kevin Martin, considering at least Kevin Martin actively gamed all the competitions to where he was almost guaranteed to win a lot of those endgame comps, while Tai wasn't. Now, again, I think you can make the argument that, okay, he didn't need to win out at the very end, and that's something to give him credit for. Though, again, I feel like that positioning was given to him because of him constantly winning competitions, which is kind of a similar spot that the Pax Bros were also in at the very end of the game. So I think they're probably around the same spot. I'd probably put him above the Pax Bros, I guess. But anyway, again, like Tai, I don't look at as too great of a player, but he's not necessarily the worst winner in the world. But with that, that's the entire season of Big Brother Canada 11. A season that, again, I do think this outcome here was extremely underwhelming. I do feel like this outcome, and particularly the last couple weeks of the show, did sour me a bit on the season, where I can understand why a lot of people do call this the worst season of BB Can. Again, like, we have this lackluster ending, we have this kind of icky start to the season, while also a very train wrecky start to the season, and then also mixing in the fact that there's no live feeds. Again, I can fully understand why people call this the worst season. I wouldn't go that far. I actually personally enjoyed a decent chunk of this season. Really, from week 2 up until double eviction, I very much enjoyed this season. I do think this was a pretty fun roller coaster of a season. Again, having these big blindsides from Rob going home. We have the Zach week, which was just an insane series of events. Seeing the downfall of the Crown was interesting to see, with everything seeming to just not go their way. And again, having Claudia have to take out Shanae, again, all that was really great. But again, once we got to the very end, where it became so clear that Tai was just going to get to the end and win, with Claudia at that point wanting to take it to the end, that's what really sunk my opinion on the season. But again, I still enjoy this season. I do think it is a season that, while again, there was a point where I probably would have had it maybe even top half of my season rankings, at this point it's not necessarily in that spot. But again, I do think it is still not the very bottom. Obviously, it's better than Big Brother 8. It's maybe better than BB Can 7. I think it's probably on par with something like a BB Can 4, with them having kind of similar trajectories. So again, I definitely feel like I enjoy this season more than most people, though I can definitely understand the major criticisms with it. But there we go. Those are my thoughts on BB Can 11. Now, like my other reviews, I will be doing a player ranking for this season, so stay tuned for that. Also, we're kind of in this time where a lot of other shows are ending, where I do have a Challenge World Championship review coming up pretty soon, along with a Survivor 44 review, which is on pace to be my longest review at this point, which that's something. And also, we have BB 25 coming up not too far from now, so stay tuned for content on all those things. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.